Good Black Arthur stood a long while after the screen went dark again. The room carried the leftover pulse of the blue light, as if the walls remembered it, as if the couch cushions had been pressed by something other than him. The window hummed with city glow, far sirens flaring and then sinking away. He rubbed his thumb across the rubber buttons of the remote and felt the ghost warmth that plastic kept from a recent touch. He told himself the mind throws up tricks when it is overtired. He told himself that flicker, that dreamlike stream of a place he knew and then did not and then knew again, had slid in sideways from some corner of himself. The television was a machine. Machines can glitch. There are stories about broadcasts that go wrong in the night. He waited for his breathing to settle. He caught his reflection faintly in the glass of the screen and did not trust it for a second. It was late and he had work in the morning. He went through the habits he'd built to put a day to bed. He rinsed the mug he kept on the coffee table and set it upside down on the drying rack. He checked the latch on the door, tugged it twice, felt the give and stop of it. He flipped the deadbolt. He turned the thermostat a notch without looking at the numbers. He pulled the chain on the lamp and the room took on the blue of the city entirely. The bedroom smelled like laundry that had taken a little too long to dry. He lay on his side and listened to the refrigerator in the next room cycle in and out. When the compressor caught, it had a particular click that always made him picture a tiny finger tapping the side of a tin can. The walls were thin. The neighbor upstairs walked with a heel-heavy step, like a person learning how to use their own feet. Arthur wrapped a pillow over his ear. He told himself the face he had just seen on the television, the wide look to the eyes, the way the mouth never quite closed, had been some trick of angles, a common panic expression, the way a person looks when they find a spider in their jacket sleeve. He slept uneasy and woke often. Each time he surfaced, he reached his arm out, palm down, and flattened his hand against the sheet as if he were bracing for some sudden tilt. A draft slid under the bedroom door and carried the living room's cool into his sleep. He dreamed unmemorable things, vague little errands that folded into one another, cheap store aisles that went on, and a parking lot painted with an endless rash of oil rainbows. When he finally sat up for good, the light outside had a hazy, early quality that did not invite him to name a time. He made coffee and watched the thin drip with his chin propped on his hand. A morning news anchor's voice came faint and bright from the little radio on the counter, talking about a lane closure on a highway he didn't use, and a new boil advisory 3 neighborhoods away. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't look at it directly either. He wanted it to be just an object again, a blank rectangle, a piece of his living room that owed him nothing and wanted nothing from him. He worked as a night custodian at the municipal bus depot, and his shift started late in the day. In the mornings, he did errands. He carried a short list in his head. He needed garbage bags, batteries, dish soap, and coffee filters. He peeled an orange over the sink and ate it in quarters, sucking the juice from the pith until the bitterness touched the back of his tongue. He put on the jacket with the broken zipper and pulled the 2 sides together with a safety pin he de-pinched from a clothes label. He took another look at the television, which gave back the room in a mild, uninterested reflection. And he said, out loud and flat, just to hear his own voice in the place, "Enough." The hallway outside his apartment smelled like bleach and fried onions. On the stairs, he met a woman from the 2nd floor who carried a stack of flattened boxes in her arms. She said in a trying voice that the elevator was down again, and Arthur made a small, sympathetic sound that did not require him to commit his face to anything more. The downstairs vestibule was full of coupons and menus stuck in the glass of the front door, S-frame, and the outside air had that dry, dusty feel that comes after a spurt of heat in early spring. At the corner store, he moved down the aisles the way he always did, with a kind of neatness he did not bother to explain to himself. He took the cheapest garbage bags, the familiar kind of batteries, The dish soap with the blue that looked like the cheap glass bottles at the antique shop, and the coffee filters in the unmarked brown sleeve. He stood at the register and watched the clerk scan each thing with that little trigger pull that made the scanner give a thin, tender beep. And he felt a pang at the sound. He thought, suddenly and without reason, of a hospital monitor. He looked at the clerk's hand, at the way motion became automatic when you did a thing for long enough. The receipt came out in a limp curl. The clerk ripped it and offered it to him with his eyes set somewhere near Arthur S.'s shoulder. Arthur said he didn't need a bag and tucked the paper in his pocket. Back at the apartment, he lined the garbage can with a new bag and put the roll under the sink. He put the dish soap under there too, beside a lean row of supplies he kept in order out of a tired stubbornness that belonged to no one but him. He put the batteries in the junk drawer with the rubber bands, the dull pencil sharpener, the stub of chalk left from marking a cut on a board some winter past. He put fresh water in the coffee machine even though he did not want another cup. It felt good to do a second round of things. It filled in space. He did not look at the television. He took the remote from the coffee table and slid it into the edge of the couch cushion, and then pushed it deeper until it met the wood of the frame. He told himself, sensibly, straightforwardly, that he would call the super about a faulty power cycling issue if it happened again. He would unplug the thing outright if it showed a mind of its own. He would buy a second-hand unit if he had to. There were simple paths through this. He showered. The hot water made the tiny bathroom puff up with steam that smelled faintly of iron. He shaved with the pointless razor that turned his face a little pink and raised a fine grit near his jaw. The mirror fogged and then cleared. When he shut the water off, it made a knocking sound in the pipes, as if a small, damp fist pressed once to the thin wall. He stood with the towel at his waist and listened as the last drops ticked from the shower head. He told himself not to go into the living room with his hair wet. He pictured, and then quickly unpictured, the television screen turning onto his reflection and his bare chest, his belly, the tired little slope of it, the wet track of hair along his sternum. He dressed for work in the pants that kept their pressing longer than they should have, and the boots that had never quite broken in. He ate a second orange and threw the rind in the garbage can and tied the bag to take it down on his way out. He picked up the remote after a moment's search and placed it flat in the center of the coffee table like a token set down to mark the end of a game. He stood with his hand on the back of the couch, looking toward the window, and felt the pull of the city through the glass. Somewhere, a generator coughed itself into steadiness. Somewhere, a truck backed down a narrow lane with the beep that was not tender at all. The neighbor upstairs dragged a chair leg over and over like a brush on a drum. He did not look at the television. He told himself he did not need to look. He glanced at it anyway, quick and sideways, and in that glance he saw only his room. He opened the door hard enough that the hinge complained a little, then eased it shut, as if the door might otherwise shimmy itself open. He went down the stairs with the garbage bag and let the weight of it bump each step, a soft, irregular thump that felt like company. In the lobby, there was a new notice taped at an angle to the bulletin board. It was a copy of a copy, the words a little muddy, the logo of the management company blurred to a lozenge. The notice said that technicians would be inspecting electrical panels in the building this week. Occupants might notice flickers or short shutoffs. No need to be alarmed. If your unit experiences an extended outage, call the number below. The paper had a thin grease stain at one corner, as if someone had pinned it with a thumb that had just handled a fry. Arthur thought of the television. He told himself he was relieved to have a practical explanation underfoot, even if it had come after the fact. He took the little comfort with a mean appetite. He worked the late shift at the depot. He liked the clean edge of the tasks. The buses came in, he and the others made them ready to go back out again. He wiped seats and emptied bins and put lost gloves on a peg that no one ever checked. He liked the wide bay with its tall doors and its smell that swung between diesel and lemon cleaner until they were one smell. He liked when the radios in the office crackled with codes that meant nothing to him and everything to somebody behind a desk. He liked the routine of walking the floor and hearing above him the buzz of the lights that were older than most of the crew. On the ride to work, he kept his eyes on the window. The bus rolled past a pharmacy where the sign out front stuttered through a series of messages about savings and a new vaccination clinic and the hours of operation. He watched the sign repeat and imagined messages tucked into the cycle that had nothing to do with a pharmacy. He tried to picture one long enough to scare himself, but his mind stayed stubbornly reasonable. He was grateful for that. The depot had its own televisions, small wall-mounted units near the dispatch windows that showed weather and radar, and once in a while a local report about street closures. Arthur found that he did not watch those now either. He kept his head down. He worked the mop slow and thorough around the feet of the plastic chairs and let the swish and squeeze of it quiet his brain. When he took his break, he ate out of a brown sack the ham sandwich that went soft by the time he reached the middle of it, a small bag of chips that left a salt film on his fingertips. He wiped his fingers on a paper napkin and folded the napkin into fourths and then into eighths until it felt like a thin tile. He told no one about the television. He had nobody to tell if he counted it plain. He had co-workers who made loud jokes and asked him now and then if he followed this team or that team, and he had the super who had tried to be friendly back when Arthur first moved in and had let the idea go slack. He had a mother he didn't call often and who he did not want to frighten with a story that would sound like the start of a decline. He had an old friend he sometimes texted when a stray memory of high school came to him in line at the store, some ridiculous thing that had felt larger than life back then, but he never pressed the little paper plane to send the message. The shift ended in the soft hour before dawn. He walked home slower than usual, keeping his steps in line with his breathing. The city had that emptied-out sound he liked, the muffled thud of a club emptying somewhere, the sharp clack of a distant train on a bridge. He imagined the television in his living room not as a thing, but as a mouth that waited quietly, not eager, not hungry, just existing where he had set it. He wondered if, when he turned the key, he would hear the hum of it from the hall. He opened the door and stood still with his hand on the knob. The apartment breathed in that same way it always did when it had been alone, a cool flatness that made him feel disloyal for noticing it. The television sat where he had left it. He put his bag on the chair and bent to untie his boots, and upstairs the neighbor dropped something heavy that made dust shake loose from the ceiling seam. Arthur set his boot against the baseboard to pry his foot out. When he looked up, the screen of the television had changed. It had not turned on. He knew the difference between on and off, but the black had shifted from the soft black that caught the room to a deeper kind of black that pushed the room away. He stepped closer and leaned down, as if it were a window he could peek through. What he saw was nothing, but it was an active nothing, a color worked at by a hand. He lifted the remote from the coffee table and held it like a talisman, thumb not on any button. He told himself it was a trick of light. Behind him, the window showed a pale strip coming under the curtain, and he drew the curtain fully closed. He told himself his eyes had adapted to the dark in the hall and were now arguing with the light here. He set the remote down. He stood with his arms hanging. The screen's black did not let him in. It gave him the feeling of standing at the mouth of a tunnel and feeling cool air crawl out of it. He plugged the television out of the wall. The cord came loose with a tired little sigh where it had been held in. The black on the screen stayed as it was. He waited longer than he needed to, then plugged it back in. The black shifted, just at the edges, then settled again. He could hear his own breathing. The refrigerator clicked its tin finger click. He took the plug out again. He took it to the kitchen and set it on the counter for no reason at all, and then brought it back and plugged it in again. This time, the screen gave a quiet flick, and then a blooming blue that looked like a clear day painted by a person who had never seen one. The blue held, and then it inverted to the stuttering white that television screens make when they're working their way toward something. Arthur took a step back. He felt the skin on his arms lift in the small, pointless points of a body alive to what it cannot name. The picture came with a soft, sweeping hiss that made him think of air moving through tall grass. No anchor, no logo, no text. The image moved like it was being carried by the wrist of a gentle thief. A hallway slid into view, long and clean, with a floor that looked polished enough to show a sheen of ceiling lights. The camera loved the hallway. It moved down it and slowed at each door that broke the plain walls. The doors were closed, all of them. Each had a brass number plate that the picture never quite settled on long enough to read. The carpet runner that ran the length of it, showed a small, repeating pattern of dots, like nail heads. Arthur felt that he had been here before at some point in his life. The way a person feels about a park or a waiting room, they must have sat in sometime, sure as they are that they could find the bathroom without asking. The picture drifted left and then right, as if breathing. It paused at a door. Arthur waited for it to open. The door did not open. The picture drifted on. The sound remained a steady hiss. He tried to tell himself it was a hotel. It could simply be that. Someone's memory of a stay, plucked from its place and made to play on his screen. The picture reached the end of the hall and turned as if on the spot. It went back the way it had come, and now on this return it moved closer to the white wall, so close that the white became a textured field that showed a faint line where two painters had overlapped their work. Arthur found this detail won him over. The dream wanted to be taken for real, showing him the joint, the slight roughness of paint where it had dried a little too fast. He leaned forward on his knees. The picture showed a door that had not been shown a minute ago. This door had no number plate. It stood a little recessed, a small pocket where the wall did something to accommodate a column behind it, an architectural compromise that made a shadow where one should not be. The camera stopped at this door, as a person might stop to listen to their heart. Arthur found that his mouth had fallen open. The door did not open. The picture passed it. The hiss thinned. The image winked, like a person rethinking a sentence mid-word, and suddenly Arthur was looking at something he recognized completely. It was the bus depot's break room, the plastic chairs, the long table with a cleanable surface, the bulletin board with the notices about safety and scheduling, the calendar that had the wrong month posted and no one bothered to flip it because who cared? The same, more or less. The picture drifted to the vending machine and settled there, fascinated, watching the little helixes that held chips and candy as if they were content in a cage. Arthur said no. He said it in the tone a person uses when catching a glass sliding off a counter. The word had no authority. The picture did not leave the vending machine. It watched it in a way that made Arthur's chest tighten. He had had a dream once where he watched his own hands move, his fingers lifting as if string pulled. This had that quality. The machine's glass shone with ceiling lights. In the reflection, a form waited, the lean suggestion of a figure just far enough back to be a question. Arthur held himself absolutely still, not because he thought the figure could hear him, but because he did not want to hear himself move. The picture turned away, slow as winter sun. It found the bulletin board. It moved in on the little pushpins that kept the papers up, red, yellow, a couple of clear ones with air bubbles trapped inside. The camera loved a bubble. It breathed on it. In the corner of the board, a small handwritten note asked if anyone had seen a set of keys with a plastic whale attached. Arthur remembered the note. He had seen it for days. He did not know if the keys had been found. The picture had no interest in that answer. It drifted, dazed. The hiss thickened. The image blinked again, and now there was a narrow yard behind a brick building Arthur did not know. The grass had gone to weedy tufts. A childish plastic ride-on car lay on its side near the fence, like a hoofed animal tipped into a ditch. A low hum passed through the sound, not the television's sound now, but an actual place noise, a transformer working across an alley. The camera tacked toward a window with a stripe of duct tape across one corner where the glass had cracked and been mended as well as could be managed. Arthur stared until his eyes begged him to blink. He forced them open, sure the blink would cost him something. He thought of calling the super, and then thought of the words that would be needed for that call, and how they would land in the ear of a man who had a toolbox and a sagging belt, and a patience that had to be portioned out like change. He thought of pulling the plug and not plugging it back in, and leaving the set face down on the rug like a person kneeling in prayer. The picture lifted as if drawn up by a string, and suddenly the window replaced itself with something else. He saw his own living room, only not like a camera sees it, but like the room saw itself. He recognized the slope of the couch cushion that always swallowed the book he was trying to read. He recognized the little shine on the varnish of the coffee table where a hot mug had once sat. The angle of it all came from the corner where the television stood, a stout thing in its joint between walls. The view had the stubborn patience of a guard dog left to watch the porch. The hiss thinned to nothing. Arthur raised his hand and let it hover. He did not want to put it to the screen. He did not want a contact. He lowered his hand and placed it on the top of the set S frame, where dust had collected in a thin line that left a print along his palm. He felt the faint warmth that tells a person a machine is still thinking when it should not be. His body remembered fear before his mind allowed it. The mouth of his stomach went sour. The skin along the back of his neck tightened, as if someone pressed a palm there. He spoke softly, as he would to a pet he did not fully trust. He said he had had a long shift. He said he wanted to go to sleep. He said it did not have to be like this. He said if the set showed him nonsense, it could at least keep it to nonsense. He said, please. The screen showed him himself now, with his hand upon the frame and his face bent to the glass. But the expression was not what he imagined it had been. The man in the television looked older by a long bit and worn by a kind of weather Arthur did not want to think about. The man's eyes had that wide look he knew from last night and had hoped was a singular look, a first and only. He saw the print of dust on the heel of the hand and the way it smeared when the hand lifted. He wondered how many eyes, at this moment, through how many sets, were seeing him see himself. The thought knocked the breath out of him. He backed away with his hands up. The television went black, the good black, the neutral kind that lets the room in again. Arthur stood until his legs trembled with the static of holding position. He unspooled himself by small measures. He picked up the plug and let it hang. He pulled the curtain open and let the pale dawn wash a little across the floor. He sat on the couch and felt the damp of sweat through his shirt. He waited for something to tell him what to do next. When nothing volunteered, he went to bed. He left the television plugged in. He pressed his face into the pillow and found the smell of laundry again, a smell that now, unreasonably, carried the thought of mildewed basements and the coolness around the bases of water heaters. He slept heavy, but not deep, like a man who has to keep both ears for a cry. When he woke, the day had rolled itself up to an unhurried noon. He cleaned the kitchen as if it had wronged him. He swept the floor and felt each bit of grit shoot into the dustpan with a satisfaction that was not satisfaction. He scrubbed the sink and made the steel go from clouded to bright and then back to clouded as the air dried it. He stacked the mail from the drop in a square that he adjusted until the edges all lined. He did not turn on the radio. The silence took his measure and set itself to it. He went to the window and moved the curtain just enough to see the slice of street. A delivery truck idled with its back door thrown up, and a man in a vest dragged boxes to a dolly, and then, with a motion that satisfied the sore muscles just to watch, tipped the dolly back and let the weight do what weight does. Across the street, a boy in a faded sweatshirt bounced a ball off a wall with a rhythmic double thud that sounded like someone knocking and then thinking better of it. Arthur stood there too long. He thought of going down and walking for the sake of walking. He thought of visiting the pharmacy sign and watching it do its tired flick. He thought of buying a plant, something that would tolerate the small light in this place and would give him a clean task of watering and turning it. He had done that before, long ago, and the plant had limped along for a while and then quit on him in a way he had tried not to take personally. He heard it then, a click. The sound came like a small polite cough from the corner. Arthur turned, slow and against the grain of every muscle. The set had turned itself on. The blue that knows nothing of sky filled the screen. It flashed through a palette of near whites and greys, the familiar dumb scramble of a machine searching for a path. He walked toward it and stopped a few steps away. The picture came in without ceremony. It took him a few seconds to understand it. He was looking at a room lit only by the irregular pulse of streetlight coming through blinds. The camera perched close to the floor, a low animal in the room. It stared across a rug at a doorway where a sliver of hallway showed. When the light outside swelled a little, he could see just enough to recognize the rug. It matched his own. He went to his knees on the real rug without meaning to and touched the loop of it. He lifted his hand and put it to the screen and felt, stupidly, for the heat that the picture did not carry. He looked toward his doorway. There was no hallway sliver because his own door stood mostly shut. He stood up and crossed the room and put his ear to the door and listened to what was on the other side. He heard the breathing stare of his building, the distant lift and fall of a radio in someone else's apartment, a laugh that died quick. He turned the knob and opened the door an inch and stood with the thin wind of the hall pushing his shirt against his ribs. He closed it again. He turned back to the set. The picture now moved like a person afraid of making noise. It slid a little to the left and showed the bottom of a low table, the shine of varnish, the leg of a chair, with a chew scar near the foot, as if a dog had once been put there and taken its distress out on wood. Arthur's body knew before his mind did that he was seeing the house he had left years back, his mother's kitchen. He knew it not by the objects which were ordinary, but by the arrangement. By the way, the table sat too close to the wall because the room had never been big enough for more than two, and on holidays had tried and failed for more. He did not sit down. He felt his legs become foreign to him and refused to acknowledge it. He stood with his hands on his hips and watched as the picture drifted to the sink, where a cup sat in the dry basin, with a coffee ring curving the bottom like a smile that didn't last. He could not do anything with the rush of recognizing. The camera lingered on the cup as if it had been placed there minutes ago. He wondered if his mother was all right. He wondered if he had let the time go too long. He wondered what he would say if he called now and she asked him what he was up to, and he said in his plain voice that he had been staring into places he had no business seeing. The picture left the sink. It went to the little window above it and pressed close to the screen, where a fly, slow with the cool, crawled like a person changing their mind a dozen times. It watched the fly until Arthur wanted to laugh. He put a hand over his mouth and pressed because laughter would not be right. The fly lifted and landed again. The camera seemed grateful. Then the picture turned and settled itself to look into the hallway that led past the laundry closet and the bathroom, and then to the bedrooms. Arthur felt a dark ribbon slip through his chest. He did not want it to go further. He did not want it to pause at his mother's door or at the door that had been his. He wanted household privacy, the kind he had never thought about when he lived in that place. He moved to the set as if he could cut the path of the picture off with his body. The picture did not go down the hall. It shivered and lost a little of its focus, and when it found itself again, it was in another place altogether. A small room showed, crowded with boxes, the lids sagging as if the contents had tried to push their way out. The air in the room heavy with dust he could feel through the glass. A single strip of tape had peeled back from one box and hung from it like a tongue. The camera backed up until a corner presented itself where a mop stood in a dented bucket. Arthur did not know this place. The feeling he had was not of recognition, but of being recognized by it. The sound that came was not the hiss of before, but a thin inland roar, as if he were hearing wind riding miles of tight-lit aisles. The picture found a calendar on the wall, the squares full of tiny writing that the focus did not hold. Arthur looked hard anyway and saw a name he could not be sure of and a time he could not name because the numbers refused to stay still. The camera's interest seemed to fray. It swung a little, not drunken, just tired. He thought of the notice in the lobby about electrical inspections. He thought of the wiring in the walls, like vines that had grown in the dark for years, and the way a person learns the moods of an old building without being told. He thought of the television as a box sitting on a stand, with plastic feet that showed cast marks when you turned it over, and of capacitors and boards and parts that had names he did not know and did not need. He tried to push the supernatural into a corner behind practicals, and the effort left him briefly light-headed. He went to the kitchen. He ran water in the sink and drank from his hands like a person fresh from a run. The water tasted of the pipes. He stood there and held the porcelain edge and felt the baseline quiver in his arms that said he might be headed for either laughter or tears, and neither seemed reasonable. He dried his hands on the towel that hung too low and had taken on the smell of every meal he had cooked in the last week. He went back to the living room. The picture had gone not to a new place, but to a new angle on the small room with the boxes. It looked now at a door with a scratched metal plate near the bottom where shoes had left scuffs year after year. The doorknob was a dark metal worn bright in a perfect circle by many hands. Arthur felt a tilt to his inner ear. The set was not showing him the world in a random scatter. It had not chosen the break room vending machine by accident or his mother's sink for the aim of it. The things were linked by him. He was the path. The set was following the thread that his life had laid through places that did not naturally touch. He took a steadying breath, and he cut the power. He set his finger to the button and depressed it until the click sounded like a thing breaking. The screen went black, and after a thin ghost of static light ran the edges, settled into the good black, the one that lets the room come back and claim its reflection. He pulled the plug for good measure. He wrapped the cord around the base and pinched it under itself like on a vacuum cleaner. He stood with the weight of his hand on the top frame. He left it and did not look back. He put on his jacket and went out. He went down the stairs to the lobby where the notice lived. He read it again to put the words into his head in order. Inspection, flicker, short shut-off. No need to be alarmed. He stared at the line about extended outages and the number to call. He pressed his lips together and thought of how much of all life could be drawn inside the shape of a phrase like that. No need to be alarmed. He walked out into the day. He did not plan his route. He let his feet take the main street and then a smaller one and then one smaller than that, where shrubs stuck their arms through fences and old leaves collected in the eddies around storm drains. He let the breath go out of him and be replaced by air that smelled like tar warming and laundry vent steam and the sugar of a bakery that still did bagels the old way on weekends. He walked until he felt the gentle burn in his calves that told him he had gone far enough. He thought of the television like a person thinks of an argument they will have later. He lined up the things he would say to it, not because he thought it could listen, but because he wanted the dignity of his own lines in his own head. He found himself at the thrift place at the edge of downtown where donations go and the lonely housings of former appliances find new homes. He went inside and listened to the bell mounted to the doorframe give its thin jangle. The place had the constant damp paper smell of too much fabric passing through. He moved among the lamps that were missing shades and the card table with its lazy leg and the baskets of remotes with the brand names worn to silver smudges. He stood, finally, before a row of televisions, their screens a procession of dark eyes. He did not want another. He did not need one. He picked one out anyway and asked the woman at the register if they delivered. She said not quite, that he could borrow the hand truck if he left some kind of card. He said he would carry it, and she laughed the way people do when they are surprised by someone else's foolishness. He left layaway money and a promise to return for it. He stepped back from the counter and raised his hands like he had shown his sincerity to a judge and been dismissed. He did not buy it, not yet. He needed to know what the one at home wanted. That was the thought he admitted to himself now. It wanted, not a word he had meant to grant it. He stood in the doorway with the bell jangling again and looked at the street as if the street could advise him. On the way back, he passed a barbershop that had kept its glass front clean while the paint on the frame peeled and showed the ghost colors of older paint jobs underneath. He watched the barber sweep a grey drift of hair into a pile and then into a pan. It seemed like a holy act, that sweep. He wanted to be in the chair with the cape around his shoulders and his head tipped the way the barber wanted it tipped. He wanted someone to put a comb to his hair and tell him he looked good. The want hit him squarely, and he swallowed it like water that came too fast. He climbed the stairs to his building slower than he needed to, touching the banister and wiping his hand and touching it again, a ritual that made the steps pass easier. He listened at his own door and then let himself in. The apartment waited the way a place waits when it has been empty a whole afternoon. The light had gone a little golden. It made the dust on the top edge of the picture frames show itself. He set his keys in the bowl by the door and then picked them up and set them down again, listening for the ring of the metal in the ceramic. The set sat in its corner with the plug coiled and the cord tucked, and for a moment he let himself believe it would stay that way now, obedient and harmless, like a radio that had been unplugged and would go to the dump when he could get someone to help him carry it. He went to the bathroom. He washed his hands and watched the suds collect around the drain and get pulled in. When he came back out, the room had a different temperature to it, a slight cool that raised the hair on his forearms. The television was on. He did not see it move. He did not hear a click. It was simply on, the blue blooming, the hiss folding itself into being. He stopped where he was. He lifted his hands and did not know what to do with them. He let them hang. The picture that came was simple and close and precise. It showed the seam where his wall met his ceiling. It loved that seam. It looked at the line of it, and at the place near the corner where the painter had missed by a hair and left a whisper of wall color on the ceiling surface. It let him breathe. He almost sobbed with gratitude at that smallness. He watched the seam until the watching became the point and not the fear. The picture slid down the wall like a bead of water. It found the thermostat and looked at it the way you would look at an injured bird, with a dread that the thing might decide not to move again. The control showed no numbers, just a needle pointing at a strip with little ticks and tiny letters. The needle trembled a little and then steadied. Arthur stood in his own life, in his own room, and made himself bear witness. He told himself he would not turn away. If there was a thread running through this, and if that thread was his, he would at least have his hands on it while it was pulled. He stood until his legs hurt and his lower back sent a dull objection up his spine. He stood until the hiss thinned and the picture drifted into a loss of light that felt less like an ending than an intake of breath before a new sentence begins. When it went black, the room came back, simple as a switch. Arthur put one hand to his chest, like a man who has climbed a staircase too fast. He looked toward the kitchen and thought of oranges and of the coffee he could make, and of the way those routines set a fence around the hours. He thought of calling his mother, and, for once, he did not push the thought aside. He wiped his hands on his pants and reached for the phone on the counter. And it was then that the electricity in the apartment sighed. The radio in the kitchen, without being turned on, breathed out a thin thread of sound that was not a station and not the emptiness between stations, but a soft, looping whisper, like someone turning a page very slowly and then turning it back again. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at the radio, and then the television, and then the light over the sink, which flickered with a health that was not health. He closed his eyes and opened them, and waited for something like an explanation to arrive in the form of a letter slid under his door. All that came was the everyday noise of a small building doing what it does when the power finds new paths in old wires. He set the phone down. He went to the television and laid his palm on the frame. He spoke a line he would not remember later. It was ordinary. It was something like, "I'm here." It would have to do. The days around him began to fold, corners touching where there had never been corners before. He woke to the room in a held breath, and the held breath stayed with him through the hours until his shift. He moved through his routines, like a man walking a floor he has been told is freshly waxed, careful, precise, sure of his own weight, and yet unsure of any step. He ate toast and watched the butter soften and disappear. He washed his plate immediately and placed it on the rack tilted away from the light. He carried the small garbage bag down to the hall chute and listened to the soft, far gallop of it, making the fall a sound that had always comforted him, because it meant things went away, because it meant out of sight could be out of mind. When he came back up, he found himself stopping a yard from his own door, listening for a shift in the room on the other side, the soft rearranging of air that meant a machine had chosen to live. The television waited. He did not let himself look straight at it. He turned the radio on, then off, then on again, and left it on low for the company of a voice that never finished a word, because static kept gently combing through it. The weather girl was prepared to talk about an approaching cool front, but whenever she neared a conclusion, the station faded, and she repeated the first clause again, caught on a loop so dainty that Arthur wanted to applaud the elegance of it if he had not been the audience. He moved the dial by a hair and found a song about nothing that might, at a stretch, have comforted him if he could have placed it in a year with people he had known. He put on his jacket. He stood in the middle of the room and forced himself to breathe in through his nose and out through his mouth. He fastened the safety pin at the jacket's throat. He told the set to behave itself in words he barely formed. He noticed something new and stupid. The way his walk to the door had become a way of skirting a field animal you do not wish to startle. He smiled at that. He found it funny in a narrow, piping way that made no sound. At the depot, he tried to come hungry to the work. He wanted to be emptied of anything that was not on the list, the crew lead repeated with a cheerful weariness. Sweep, wipe, restock, note, anything sticky note, anything cracked, bring up any unusual personal items to the office, and so on. He found that he took comfort in the phrases the lead always used, that little liturgy of instruction, wide as it was in its application and small in its end result. He liked the feel of the rag in his hand as it came away grey or brown, or the weak yellow of soda, liked the shiny track it left behind, liked the draw of the chemical in the air and the way it left his inner nose clean and a little burned. In the break room, the small wall television was on, and sputtering images about civic meetings and a street festival scheduled in a part of town where Arthur did not often go. He kept his eyes on it just long enough to tell himself it was ordinary. The minute he let his gaze rest, the screen broke itself into a field of loud color squares, then reset and returned to the news. The others groaned and then joked with the meanness that an error like that draws out of people, whether they mean to be mean or not. Arthur raised his ham sandwich in a hello. He sat alone at the edge of the table, as was his habit. He did not want to be looked at, which made him think of the set, which made his throat tighten, which made the bread dry hard at the roof of his mouth, like he was trying to eat a stack of papers. He worked the floor with the long dust mop and felt the tug of it gather a day's worth of grit. He thought, for some minutes, not of anything in particular, and those were blessed minutes. He listened to his own breath and to the sweet mournfulness of a bus horn as it backed out into the yard and then went forward into night. He wiped a chocolate smear where a heel had ground it to the tile and thought of nothing again. And again, bless that. He could hold that blankness until the moment he stepped into the supply closet for a head of fresh mop, and with the familiar stink of bleach and wet string filling his sinuses, found himself standing in the frame of a scene the set had shown him. The boxes in the supply space had their lids bowed. The mop leaned in its dented bucket. The calendar was on the wall and filled with handwriting so small that a person had to stand near to read it. He placed his palm flat to the door jamb and had the sudden useless urge to explain himself to the room, as if he had been caught somewhere he should not be. He felt watched by a field of empty things. He backed away and closed the door and stood with his eyes at half-mast, the way a person fattens time when they do not want to move forward. The radio on the dispatch desk crackled with a man he had never met complaining about a route change. Arthur waited. He opened his eyes fully. Everything was as it had been moments ago. He put the new mop on the handle and worked the ringing bucket with its crank that squealed in a childlike way that usually amused him. He did not laugh. Toward the mid of the shift, a paper went up on the break room board about power conservation in the neighborhood. Rolling brownouts, the flyer said, borrowing a term from somewhere far away, a word that always sounded old, like rationing and water by the bucket. The city, or a piece of it, had tugged hard on the grid, and the grid had said no. Please unplug anything you can. Please do not run large appliances between evening and early morning. If you experience a complete loss of service, contact the provider. The list of numbers ended with a line that looked like it had been added later by an unsure hand, the ink darker, the letters too tall. Avoid unnecessary use of screens after sunset. Arthur put a finger to that line like a man measuring a cut on wood. He let his hand drop before anyone could ask what he was pointing to. He went home tired enough to hurt in the shoulders, and tiredness did him no good. The set pulled at him the way a worry pulls at a tooth. He turned the knob and stepped into his living room and waited for the temperature in the air to tell him if anything had changed while he had been gone. The apartment was cool as a sink that had not been used. The set wore its good black. The radio whispered nothing. The refrigerator's regular knock announced itself, and then, like a person aware of being rude, hushed. Arthur stood in the middle of the room and swiveled on his heel and then stopped, ashamed of the strange ritual but moved by it. He kept his jacket on. He collected things. He took the folded blanket from the back of the couch and spread it over the television as if he were putting a birdcage down for the night. He put the plug on the floor, went to the socket and took it from the wall. He placed a book on top of the plug as if it were some skittish animal he wished to keep in place. He turned the radio around to face the wall. He did not own a laptop. He had never needed one. His phone lived in a drawer beneath the cutlery. He took the phone out, switched it off, and put it face down on the floor like a placard. He did all that the flyer would have had him do and more. He stood and felt briefly like someone who had cleaned a room to make it fit for sleep. He lay down on the couch with the kind of fatigue that nearly makes tears out of itself and slept. He woke from a dream of sweeping an endless tiled hallway that led nowhere. The waking world was quieter than the dream. He did not move for a while and let the quiet tell him what time it was. He could feel the slight cool in the air that comes when the night is moving its back between one part of itself and another. He sat up and put his ear toward the blanket-covered thing, the way a person leans toward a baby to hear whether the ribs are doing their work. He thought for a flick that he could be tender toward this machine if only it would choose a side and either behave or not. He laughed at that, and the laugh stuck in his throat like a kernel. A subtle glow lifted the edges of the blanket. It made a soft blue halo under the weave, as if the set had decided to be polite about the waking it intended. Arthur closed his eyes. He opened them. He took the book off the plug and found the plug still out of the wall. Electricity, then, had become a loose idea. He did not rest anyone's theory on that. He did not have a theory. He had the blanket he lifted and the light that met him, and the same loneliness as every other night. On the screen, his living room was shown from the corner where the television sat, but the angle was a hair wider, as if the camera inside the world could lean into the wall. The rug, the table, the couch, the faint scuff on the paint where a chair had once knocked it. No sound. He looked for himself. He was not there. He had the new fear a person has when they walk into a room and do not see a cat where the cat always is. An irrational panic that fills the entire chest cavity, dumb and choking. He stood from the couch and then watched himself stand from the couch. The picture lagged him by a fraction of a beat. He lifted his right hand. The man on the screen lifted his right hand just after. He had not known truly, until that hitch in the mirror, that the set was not showing him past or memory this time but now. He raised both hands and put them, palms out, toward the screen. The man in the set did his best to follow. The flatness of the delay gave Arthur the unsettled sensation of being watched by something thinking slowly, as if it had to work through a little equation in its head before returning him the answer. He put the blanket back and told the set out loud that they were not doing this. He took the blanket off again because not looking would be worse. He went to the wall and pressed his ear to it to see if he could make a joke of listening for the ocean. He heard, in the wall, only the twitchy, static life of wiring. And beyond that, in the next apartment, a person clearing their throat a little too often, as if they were trying to cough up a thought and could not. He wandered the boundaries of his own room, like a man checking fence posts. He put his hand against the glass of the window and felt the chill, and felt, more than felt, that the set had tilted its attention toward his back. He turned in one motion and was there on the screen, turning, his movements a split second behind. He thought of dancing slowly with someone who cannot find the beat. He thought of children making faces at their reflections in a microwave door. He did not think of any of that long, because with the turn came a change. The picture swam and found a different room, and the different room was a hallway he knew and did not. A long throat of paint and light and identical doors, the same as before, and not. The hiss came with it, so soft and even that it matched the sound a person makes when they are trying not to cry. The camera drifted. The same numberless door presented itself in its shy, tucked-in pocket. Arthur set the heel of his hand in the notch above his upper lip and pressed until he had to stop or bruise himself. He did not know the door. He knew its feeling. Something pressed in then from outside his window. A siren locally thin, a police car easing by rather than running hard. A bus line from a car going past 2 streets over, slow and non-committal. The set hummed with the attention it was paying that door. Arthur could not stand it. He crossed the room, opened his front door to bleed the feeling, and leaned into the hallway. The dark was there in its ordinary way. The emergency light near the far stairwell blinked off, then on, then off, not struggling so much as showing a lack of interest in continuity. The air in the hall had a smell of hot metal that belonged to an old motor, somewhere being asked to be new. No one else's door was open. He pulled his own door gently shut and turned back to the set as if he had left a stove on. The picture now showed a close view of a surface so ordinary that it took Arthur a moment to name it. It was the inside of a refrigerator door, molded plastic, a depression where a carton of eggs could live. A shelf with a drizzle of something old and sweet, curled like thin varnish. A hand came into the frame, his own hand by the look of it, a scar near the knuckle from a summer with a box cutter, and the hand tilted a jug and poured milk into a glass that was not quite clean. The camera nested itself in the choice of angle, small and intimate and untheatrical, without the showman's respect for ease. Arthur felt, ridiculous as it would sound spoken aloud, that the set wanted to be kind to him for a minute. The hand moved out, the refrigerator door closed, the scene blinked. A different room, a bathroom with a yellowing tub where the lime scale had been battled to a drawer. A toothbrush lay near the sink, its lip, with the bristles splayed out like the hair of an exhausted child. A towel hung on a hook and carried the smell of a long time of use, an animal funk that came from water not letting go. The camera stared at the drain in the tub until Arthur's skin crawled. He wanted to reach into the picture and twist the stopper up and hear the breath of the pipes. Another blink. The alley behind the building. A single lamplight made its small island in the damp. A fox trotted quick on its toes across the far end of the frame, the way foxes do when they know they are not welcomed and want to get through the light fast. Arthur told himself this gentle attack, this tour of the ordinary, was worse somehow than the corridors and the numberless doors. It had the feel of someone warming up to a subject that would be harder to say. The hiss deepened, then retreated, and the screen went black. The room returned with a small household sigh. Arthur sagged and then straightened his backbone by bone. He went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee that would keep him awake into a morning he did not need to wake into. He drank it standing at the counter. He thought of his mother and of the window above her sink and the fly that had walked and walked. He thought of calling her and rehearsed in a bland tone how he would ask about her week and the aches she would list and the way she would tell him she had meant to organize the pictures but had found herself sitting and going through them, and that a day can go to nothing like that. He wanted the nothing of that day for himself. He poured the rest of the cup down the drain and rinsed it with the lazy care of a man who cannot decide whether to be careful or to say to hell with it. He left the set uncovered, still, in case the blanket had made it worse. He left the plug out of the wall and the plug's prongs bare as teeth. He went to bed. Sleep came like a clerk with a stack of papers asking for signatures. He signed again. He woke with the feeling that he had made an agreement he would regret. On his next day off, the flyer at the depot became a poster in his own building's lobby. The new paper pinned the same words in a sterner font. There were calls for compliance and warnings about preventable accidental fires. So much could be prevented if people listened. He ran his finger along the bottom edge and knew with a calm clarity that made him feel crazy that someone had called and complained, and that someone else had told someone else that the tenants needed to be reminded. He thought about saying to the super that his set did as it pleased, regardless of whether it was pulling power or not. He knew the mouth the super would make if those words hit it. He did not go to the office. The city felt off in the way a person feels off after an illness. Buses drifted their routes a shade slow so that the corners of schedules did not meet, and people missed connections and were late to things they'd already decided did not matter. The corner store's card machine worked, then did not, then worked again with a grumpy beep. The pharmacy sign kept its messages pegged to a single phrase about patients from morning almost to evening, and when it finally cycled to the hours of operation, the letters jittered and then steadied like a hand calming itself. Arthur wanted to believe it had nothing to do with him. He wanted, and failed, to find himself small again inside a grid that would not bother to notice him. He took inventory of what was his to control. He borrowed a hand truck from the thrift shop, leaving more than a promise. He wrestled the old set off the stand and onto the dolly with the kind of care a man gives an injury that isn't tea in his own body. He strapped it down with the bungee cords the woman at the counter had in a bin. He rolled it down the hall, trying not to make a sound with the wheels, which was foolish because the wheels made the sound they made, and that was that. The elevator had a note on it he did not want to read. He took the stairs. On the landing, he paused and breathed like he had climbed a hill. He told himself this would end one way or another today. Outside, the city had braced itself against wind that had found gaps in every seam. The television on the dolly felt heavy in an honest way that belonged to things made before design had learned how to mix strength with lightness. He wrestled it onto the sidewalk and stood with the lip of the dolly against the curb and considered the street. The bell on the thrift shop door rang for someone else going in as he crossed carefully. He wheeled the thing inside to the tune of a small, pleased laugh from the woman, who seemed genuinely amazed he had done what he said he would do. He told her he did not want a refund so much as a trade, and she was generous about it in the way tired people who have decided the day is already long can be generous. He picked out a slimmer set with a screen like a placemat and a frame a person could pinch with 2 fingers. He signed his name on a dotted line he did not read because he had read all the dotted lines he needed to read in his life. He forgot to be cautious and let the woman see he was nervous. She told him kindly that sets either behave or they do not, and if this one threw an attitude, he could bring it back any day they were open. He thanked her with a softness that came over him and that he did not fight. He carried the new thing home like a sacrament. He hated that thought and could not help having it. Up the stairs, past the elevator that now had no note, into his door, across the threshold, into the room that had done him no special wrong except to house the wrong thing. He set the new set where the old set had been. He did not plug it in. He sat with it for a minute and waited for the feeling. The feeling did not come. He left it unplugged and went to the sink and ate an orange, and watched the peel curl and fall into a little ring in his hand. He put the peel in the trash and tied the trash to go out, and then, untying it 2 breaths later, put the peel back on the counter, as if it might be useful for something after all. He laughed, finally, a real laugh that sounded more like an expulsion of breath to make a space. He carried the trash out. When he came back up the stairs, he could hear his neighbor upstairs, walking their heavy heel-first walk. He could hear a television in some room on the other side of the building, murmuring a show with a laugh track that came in wrong, the laughter not matching anything that might deserve it. He unlocked and opened his door. The new set was on. He had not plugged it into anything. A pale, almost polite light, different from the old machine's strange blue, washed the ceiling. The screen showed a view from the corner where it sat, the wide angle of a lens, not usually interested in corners. The couch, the table, his jacket tossed skinned across the chair. The depth of field was odd. The print on the rug looked both sharp and soft. Arthur put a hand out toward the wall and tried to feel where a person would feel the seam of tide change. He had the impression of a boundary moving through him, the way a shadow on water passes through water. He walked to the set and said nothing. It did not matter what he said. He thought, for the length of a breath, of mouthing some nonsense about a test. He reached behind the unit and felt for plugs that were not there, and for the soft, rubbery sheath of a cord that did not exist. He took his hand away and held it up, then down, then up again. He watched himself mirror those motions a half-beat later on the screen. He had to smile at the dumb performance of it. He did not like the look of his own smile. It looked like the smile of an actor in a training video, told to be approachable and trustworthy. He went and got the old blanket and laid it over the new set and pressed the edges down into the gap between cabinet and floor. He stood back. The blanket glowed from underneath and began to move as if a light wind were running under it in circles. He took it in his hands and lifted it, and had a feeling like peeling a bandage off a patch of skin that is not quite healed. The picture had changed while he had done that small ritual. It now showed the lobby of his building, and the lobby looked like a room in a cheap hotel that had tried to be better. An arrangement of chairs that had never known bodies, a fake plant in a pot that had little half-moons where the vacuum cleaner had bitten it over time, the bulletin board with the new poster about power. Arthur leaned in to see if he could read any of the smaller notices, and could not. The camera had no interest in the words. He was not going to call anyone. He would not be the man who brought this to another person and placed it between them as a problem to be solved. He decided this with a firm quiet that made him feel disloyal to his own safety. He turned away to make something to eat, and then did not eat it, picked it over and threw it away, and then picked it back out and ate it cold. He drank water from the sink and swished and watched the slow swirl as it went down. He returned to the living room for the thing he did not want. The set wanted to talk about time. It showed him the depot and the depot's clock above the dispatch windows where the second hand was slightly off true. It showed the second hand diving and then hitching as if the edges of its spaces were uneven and some steps were longer than others. The camera tilted and tilted again and took in the sweep of the bay with its bus noses lined like quiet animals waiting for rain. A man crossed the far edge of the frame with a broom on his shoulder, and another followed, pushing a bin with a will that made Arthur want to cheer. He looked for himself and did not find himself. He told himself he'd been outside then, smoking nothing at the back of the yard, just standing and letting night sit on him while he sat on night. He remembered that exact feeling and almost shivered it off before he stopped himself from performing. The picture jumped, and the jump made a soft, stretched sound in the room like elastic missnapped. He saw the small square office where the crew lead and the dispatcher sat with two radios and the moral certainty that comes from having two radios. A man Arthur knew by sight but not by name was in the office talking too fast and too friendly. The crew lead looked beyond him to some point near the floor and nodded with a patience that had run half out. The dispatcher did not look up. The man kept talking. He was funny when he was tired. A paper slid out of the printer on the desk and folded forward and hung there, weightless at the end of its curl, until the other papers beneath it pulled it down. It was nothing, and Arthur wanted to cry at it. He turned away and walked into the kitchen and walked back again. The set showed the door in the hallway again, the numberless one in its pocket. It let that image sit until the first bite could work on him like a spice. Then the image doubled very slightly. A ghost of itself laid under itself, and the handle moved. It did not turn. It moved in slow, small pulses the way unconsciously handled things do when they are not yet in active use. Someone on the other side had placed their fingers around it and did not know their fingers were saying anything. The camera drew a fraction closer. Arthur could not feel his feet or the floor they stood on. He put all of his weight into his heels as if that would anchor him. The handle stilled. The picture cut to black so sudden that Arthur flinched. The radio in his kitchen breathed a rope of noise that almost formed a word and did not. The refrigerator clicked its tin tap. Upstairs, the neighbor dragged the chair leg in its slow punishment circle. The sound world then was healthy. A man could believe in it. He stood in it for a long minute and let it cover him like a warm coat someone else had left on a chair and that he had slipped on and chosen never to return. He went to bed and did not sleep right away. He lay on his side and counted breaths in a childish act he had not done for years. He made it to an invented number that pleased him and then failed to please him and thought he would never sleep. And then he slept and did not know it. The day passed that way, and the next one enough like it to make the days indistinguishable in his mind. If the set was switched on by its own will, it showed him threads tied to his own life. If it was left alone, it sulked with quiet. If he ignored it hard enough, he felt a tug in himself, a bodily awareness, not unlike thirst. and when he went to look, the screen had a view of something near to him, a corner of his own hallway, or the small lived-in sadness of the sink in the building S laundry room. He slipped deeper than he thought possible into a kind of etiquette with it. He did not speak aloud to it more than he had to. He found himself apologizing when he crossed the line of sight, the way a person says, "Excuse me for a sneeze." He made a point of wiping down the table so the set could see its shine, and be reminded that he was not a man lost to himself. He never sat straight in front of it. He never faced it square like a man who wants a fight. He approached from the side and looked with one eye as if he were checking the weather through another person's window. On a morning that felt older than it should, he kept a promise to himself and called his mother. He did not mention anything he could not say plainly. He listened to her talk about the little stove on the back porch she had gotten for canning, and how the thing had gone out twice while she'd been doing jars of peaches, and how she had sworn at it and then lit it again and felt foolish and proud all at once. She asked him if he was working too much like always, and if he was eating right, and if he had fresh socks. He said the crew had been short lately, which was true, and that he would pick up socks on his walk, which he would. He said he was thinking of a haircut. She liked that idea and went on at length about the barber on her side of town and how a man ought to find a person with steady hands and not be shy to sit and let someone else make him neat. He promised to visit soon. He felt the heat of the lie because soon did not belong to him anymore. The set had made that clear. He hung up and leaned his head into the kitchen cabinet and let the wood press a line into his forehead until it hurt. He went down to the store and bought socks and dish soap and a cheap plant that the girl at the register told him would suit the light he described. He carried the plant home carefully and set it on the sill and turned its leaves toward the window with a gentleness that felt righteous. He watered it and watched the soil darken. He thought, for a brave half-breath, that it would be good to have something else in the room that would grow whether he watched it or not. He promised it water on some every other day that he would name by hand, because he had lost count of the way days landed. He wiped the pot and arranged the saucer under it and stepped back, and had the tempered joy of seeing a saw-toothed little leaf settle into a posture that looked like acceptance. That night, he slept without dreaming and woke to a soft grey. The set was showing the plant, close and enamored of its small teeth. A drop of water still clung to the tip of one leaf and gathered light obediently. The camera studied the drop as if it hoped to learn how to be a drop itself. Arthur stood and watched and felt a patience in his bones that might have healed something if given long enough. The picture shifted toward the soil and the crust a person forms when a plant is watered too often and not enough. It was a mild admonishment that made him smile again because it was deserved. The plant did not move. The set did not blink. He was almost charmed. The charm broke. The picture fell into a corridor, then into the break room at the depot, then into the small office, and then into an angle that Arthur had not seen before. The top step of the stairwell behind the bay doors, where a locked gate kept the curious from climbing to the walkway, where a man could look down on the whole place. The camera stared at that gate with an attention that knew how metal held itself together. Arthur felt his stomach go low. He was going to be shown something he did not want. He said aloud softly, "Cut it out." The hiss did not change. At the top of the stairs, just within the edge of the frame, a pair of work gloves lay on their sides like animals at rest. The camera did not move nearer. It wanted him to notice the gloves. It wanted very badly for him to recognize them. He did not at first. Then he did. He knew the nick on the cuff of one and the crease in the palm of the other from 100 times reaching for them on a peg near the laundry machines to take them out with him to shake clean. He had not lost them. They were at home. He had seen them hanging on his own peg that morning. The camera did not care what he believed. It stayed with the gloves and made time with them. He went to his own peg in his own hall and checked. They were there. He touched them and came back to the set with his hand still on the stitches. He looked long enough at the image that he found he was holding his breath, and he let it out and breathed in with a choke. He did not know what the set wanted by showing him things out of place in places he recognized. He did not wish to wait for proof. He did not have to wait until the end of the shift. He got to work and went about the list, and near the mid of the night, he found himself in the office to fill out a slip, and saw through the open door of the stairwell across the hall the pair of gloves lying like animals. He stood still and let the slip of his pen roll from his fingers to the desk. He had no memory of bringing them, and yet he did not trust forgetting as an argument. He went to the base of the stairs and pressed the gate. It held. He put his hand between the rungs and lifted the gloves out with his fingertips. They were his gloves, with the nick and the crease. They smelled like the work they had done, and like the soap he had used when last he washed them, and like the slightly sweet dust of the upper walkway, where grime goes when no one asks it to feed anyone else. He took them back to the office and set them on the desk and smoothed them with his palm. The dispatcher looked at him and the gloves and said nothing. Arthur did not offer a joke. He did not ask a question. He put the gloves in his back pocket and felt like a shoplifter and a man returning a thing that had never left his house. He waited for the next thing because the next thing always comes. He was not disappointed. He was disgusted at his own expectation being met. That same night, past the hour when the vending machines make their little clunk noises and the crew goes quiet, a bus came in with a windshield that looked wrong. The glass was starred near the center, a spider web like an ice bloom. The driver said a bird had gone for it and lost. He laughed with the sharpness of a man coming down from a startle. The night team shook their heads in the way men shake their heads when something has to be worked around. Arthur looked at the star and thought of a tiny "You are here" note on a shopping mall map. His body remembered without words the image of the numberless door's handle moving by a twitch. He went inside the bus. He sat in a seat near the front and put his hand on the back of the seat ahead of him and felt the oil of the city built up there, slick and human. He did not look up. He would not give the set, wherever it was, the satisfaction. He went home late that morning. The apartment had a stale pastry smell that made him think of a breakfast he would never eat. The plant had lifted itself half a degree toward the light. He greeted it in his head without force. He did not dare be fond. He did not turn toward where the set waited in its corner. He shaved. He washed his face with the rough towel and thought of the animal funk of the towel in his mother Ayes' bathroom and wished for a minute that he had stayed a son forever in that house, small and other people's responsibility. He crossed the room and sat on the couch. The cushions had memorized his shape and gave it back to him with the tenderness of a chair at a diner where a man has sat most afternoons for a decade. He put his hands on his knees. He cleaned his nails with the corner of a receipt. He listened. The set hummed. It had learned how to be quiet, which he resented because it meant it was thinking in the way people use that word, consciously doing a thing to bring about a certain effect. He could sit there for a long time and not move, and the set would show nothing to punish him for the stubbornness. It didn't need punishment. It had patience enough to go forever. He said this to himself in words so flat they scraped. He spoke aloud without looking at it. He said, "I need to know what you want." He waited. He said it again, and then again, softer. Silence, then a blip in the sound field that threw itself here and there like a moth. He could not tell if the blip was reply or coincidence or the whispering of wires settling. The picture came, and it was the quietest thing the set had ever given him, which is to say it was worse. It showed the inside of his own refrigerator and the shelf with the curling spill and the place where a carton might live. It showed that surface not in quick glance but in long looking. The camera was not making sense of it. It was living with it. The long look said, without saying, that the set knew what was near him, that it knew what he would touch and when, that it could fit inside those motions without being noticed if it wished. He stood up fast, not because of a sudden idea, but because sitting was too intimate to a thing like this. He went into the hall and put on his boots and laced them, and then pulled them tight so the seams bit his ankles. He took no bag. He closed the door behind him and let the latch catch and tested it again, giving himself a mechanical task that made his breathing even. He went to the barber with the glass front, where the swept hair made grey drifts on the black mat like fog. He sat in the chair and let the cape fall over him. He met his eyes in the mirror out of politeness to the man working, and then kept his eyes on the barber's collar. He gave the instructions he had settled on and felt the slight tremble in his own voice as the scissors made their click whisper. He was surprised by the calm that came over him when another man's careful hands made neat work of his head. He wanted to weep and did not. The barber asked if he had any plans for the rest of the day, and Arthur said, in a voice smooth as a switch, that he was going to throw out a broken television. He walked the whole route home with his new cut tight to his skull and his scalp tingling like a burn. He felt lighter and then ashamed of the feeling. He opened his door and stepped inside with the confidence he had bought for himself. He turned to the set with the intent to act and saw something he had not expected. His own living room on the screen, as if seen from the set, as if a camera had been cut into the corner at the angle where the plastic frame met the wall. He had seen that angle before. It was not new. What was new was the way the screen now carved the time, not into past memory or near present, but into foretaste. He moved his hand. The man in the set moved his a shade after. He took a step. The image lagged. He took another, and then his future self stopped and bent and did a thing he had not planned to do, but could see himself now deciding to do. He lifted the plant from the sill and set it on the coffee table. The image showed him reach for the blanket then and place it over the plant. His present self had not yet moved. He watched himself half a moment ahead of himself, parenting the little green thing and tucking it in against a night it had no need to fear. He stood very still. He felt like an animal who had heard the thin pulse of a predator through the ground. He did not look at the plant. He watched the man who was him, but not yet. He waited for that man to do something worse, to commit some harm or some shame. He could not stop, and when the man only smoothed the blanket and stepped back and put his fingers to his temple in a thoughtful gesture he did not recognize. Arthur made the gesture in his own confusion and felt the oddity of being taught a tick. The picture blinked and blinked again, faster than any blink he had seen before. It stuttered. It looked for breath. When it came back, it showed the hallway inside his building, not the place of the front where people came and took their time walking in, but the service corridor where the boxes lived when people moved, and where, on recycling day, the soft collapse of cardboard could be heard like low applause. The camera scooted close to the floor. A shadow passed out of frame at a tilt that could have been someone carrying a chair. Arthur gripped the back of the couch with his hand and felt the old wood shift a little under his weight. He said, "Enough," in a voice he barely knew. He meant it like a prayer. He meant it like a curse. His mouth knew, as mouths know for men who work alone, how to keep the sound rare. The set cared nothing for the new discipline of his voice. It sent him the cracked plate of a long, settled shelf in a hallway he had walked years ago. Then the brass of a doorknob he had known when he was a child, and the light threw a stripe across it morning after morning. Then the low-lit cave of a garage where a light sensor waited for a motion that never came. Each image was flat, and anyway beautiful, and anyway cruel. He lost track of the stretch of the day after that. He measured time by the slow movement of light as it slackened and then bowed, and then bled into the kind of blue that rooms like his keep. He boiled water for pasta and let it boil over and buffaloed the burner clean with a wet rag, and then waited for the smell of gas that did not come because it was an electric stove, and why would there be gas? He laughed aloud at himself for that one and leaned his hips against the counter and rubbed his eyes hard, as if he could scratch something out of them. He went back and forth between rooms, not because he needed anything in either, but because motion made everything more bearable. Evening grew properly dark, and the neighborhood entered that strange pause between the second dinner and the late driveway argument. He stood at the window and watched the pharmacy sign finally give up and go dark completely, which he had never seen, and the whole corner took on a raw look, with the sign gone a face that was no longer smiling and could now show what it had under the smile. He sat again. He held the bulky remote of the old set in one hand, though the object in the corner had no use for it. He turned it over and over until the back slipped and the batteries fell, and he caught one without thinking and did not bother to catch the other and listened to it roll under the cabinet and out of reach, and he felt an embarrassed relief at losing something small that had belonged to a worse day. The power in the building sagged then. The radio sighed out again and in again like a sleeper turning. The lights did a short dim. Somewhere water hammered for a moment in a wall and then ceased. Arthur held his breath. He had the sense of a house bracing like a crowd before a fireworks shot that may or may not misfire. A low hum ran through the building in a tone just at the edge of hearing. It kept itself there as if it wanted to be polite. The set did not wait for answer from anyone. It warmed itself and bloomed into a picture with no sound, just the steady hiss a person begins to love when there is nothing else to hang on. The camera sat on the floor of his living room, in the strange low place it favored when it wanted the table S-legs very tall. It watched his doorway. Arthur, in the room, turned his head toward the same doorway. The hall beyond it was simple and dim. He thought of going to open the door a little, of making the picture match the room, as if that would heal something. He stayed where he was because he had decided, in the last unfeatured hour, that he would not participate except where he was drafted. On the screen, the doorway stayed empty. Then, not with suspense but with a lazy canine certainty, the edge of a shadow thickened and a person came into view. The person was Arthur himself, carrying his coat across his arm in the way he always carried it when he was tired. He saw himself pause and look toward the television and then turn away from it, a habitual flinch, a small refusal. He watched his future make denial into a normal walking. It unsettled him to a depth that books do not speak about. He moved his hand to his chest and to the place there that had ached some winters fiercely after shoveling, and then had learned to ache less as he learned to move slower. He did not do the thing the man did on the screen, not then. He sat and chose to be stubborn, because stubbornness was what he had ever possessed in quantity. He told himself this was a delay, that it was not fate. He said in his mind that he would simply stay sitting until the man on the screen gave up and dissolved, and that would be a victory. He almost had himself in line for it when there came a sound at his door. The particular sound a key makes when it is tried in a lock it fits, but is not sure of. He froze. The set did not wait. The set showed the door in the screen S doorway open on the screen before the sound at his real door paused to consider going on. In the screen, the door swung in and the man walked through. In his room, a hand fell away from the knob, as if the person outside had been reminded of something and decided to leave. Arthur stood, and his knees hurt for the first time in days. He felt the tender loyalty of his body, wanting to keep him upright and calm and serviceable. He put his hand on the back of the couch. He did not go to the door. He watched the version of himself in the screen slide the coat off his arm and place it on the chair skin side up, like it was something with breath. He watched that man look toward the set and then put his chin down and widen his chest the way men do when they want to be bigger than a feeling. He watched the man take the plant from the sill and put it on the table and put the blanket over it, with one palm smoothing the pile. He watched that hand continue to smooth after the blanket was already laid, the way a hand will continue to pet a dog with no memory of stopping. He lifted the blanket from the couch back and did not, in his own present, walk to the window. He did not touch the plant or the blanket. He did not follow. He watched himself do it. He let the man in the set take the responsibility, because that man was the one who had been given the scene. When the man in the set turned to look toward the door again as if hearing something, Arthur himself heard nothing. His room was quiet. The set was quiet, except for the hiss that was now so neutral that he did not hear it as a thing apart from the air. The future Arthur in the screen leaned down and spoke a word. Arthur could see the shaped mouth and could not, for once, hear the echo of his own speaking. He'd always been able to get some sense of sound off the hiss, like a trick of the ear, like lip reading a person who belongs to you. Now there was nothing. The mouth moved, the chin tipped, the eyes went to the right in a habit he knew, and the word fell into the vacuum. The smoothness of it made him swallow his own spit loudly enough that his real ear hurt. The set blinked off. The room took breath like a punched man. From upstairs came a single ruined curse, then another, the neighbor finally, expressing a pure thought without shoes. Somewhere a car alarm made 2 angry barks and then thought better of it. The plant on the sill had not moved. The blanket lay where he had left it, which was not on the plant. He realized his fist had made itself. He opened it and looked at the little moons of nail marks in the pads, the tiny marks that would go away without him having to do anything. He slept and woke and did not know which he was doing. He went to work and came home. He did the tasks the list asked of him. He kept his kindnesses small and secret. He let the set do what it would do and met it with the lowest voice he had. He made time pass in hand-wide measures he laid end to end, on an evening a week into this new shape of living. If a man needed to call it a week, his building held a meeting. A typed sheet slid under doors to let people know to meet in the basement room, where rent checks are sometimes made and sometimes bounce. The note said there would be an update about the electrical inspections and the schedule for the next rounds, and a reminder of best practices for safety. It did not say what the update was. Arthur went, because to have faces around him would be a way to remind himself he was not alone in a house that had begun to speak in a voice he knew better than any other. Downstairs, chairs had been set up in lines. A man in a shirt with the management company S lozenge on it tried to look more comfortable than he was. The super watched the room from near the door, as if he had been placed there for security and had accepted the frame. People took seats with the choreography of neighbors, nods at familiar shapes, little embarrassed smiles, a wave held low. Arthur sat at the end of a row. He let his knees angle out to make his frame a little larger. He held a plastic cup of water and did not drink it. He felt the weight of the room's attention on what was to be said, and liked it in the way you like strong gravity when you have been in a place without gravity a while. The man from management spoke about transformers and mains and meters. He used words as if they were tools he had borrowed that morning and hoped to return with no damage. He smiled when the crowd smiled and nodded when he said to unplug unnecessary devices and to report any strange behavior in outlets or in appliances as soon as it was noticed. A woman from the second landing said her television clicked itself on and off in the night and that she had assumed it was some neighbor with a universal remote being a jerk. The room laughed. The man from management said in his careful way that when electrical systems are under load, devices can sometimes act like that. The super said from the door, "Please call me." The crowd murmured in the neutral tone people take when they feel briefly unified by inconvenience. Arthur did not raise his hand. He did not talk. He watched the faces. He watched a man rub his thumb along his jaw and then rub it again when he realized he had rubbed it a first time. He watched a girl slide the rubber band on her wrist up and snap it, then up and snap it again, her eyes fixed on the carpet. He watched the water cooler in the corner cough and swallow the way those coolers do when they are gathering the will to be useful. He felt a little human. He thanked the room for that in his chest and did not stay for cookies. He went back upstairs with a chunk of the crowd and let their sounds go with him, keeping them near until he could get his own door shut behind him. He turned on the kitchen light, then off, then on again in a silly way that made him smile. He wanted to look at the set and did not want to look at it in equal parts. He stood in the doorway between rooms and swallowed and swallowed. He went toward it with his chin up. The screen had already found him. It had been patient in his absence and now expressed its patience by showing the thin, unimportant fact of light moving across his wall like water. It sat with that for longer than he would have thought effective if he were making a show of any kind. He admired its lack of showman's nerves. He waited until his own breathing fell into the slow rhythm the light suggested. He waited until the light faded almost to nothing and returned. When the picture changed, it did not jump. It flowed, and in that flow, there was the small, mean grace a dancer has when they know the steps better than anyone, but want no one to notice the knowing. He was looking at the apartment across the hall from his, at the seam under the door where a soft nightlight inside made a line. He had never been inside that apartment. He did not want to be now. He felt he was inside it anyway. The picture slid upward, as if the camera were being stood up by careful hands. The peephole filled the frame. The lens on the other side threw back a little bright eye. Arthur took a step without meaning to and returned himself to place by putting his palm to the back of the chair and feeling the grain. The next scene was the service corridor again, and this time there was noise with it, not hiss, but a thinner thing under the hiss, as if the layer of hiss were being used to hide the voice of the walls. He could not make out words. He could make out a rhythm as steady and patient as his own heart. He matched to it. He felt foolish and then did not feel foolish because he had surpassed that stage a long while back without seeing it pass. The camera moved low and showed him the seam where the floor met the wall and the place where a mop had not quite gotten the last line of dirt and where human feet had reaffirmed and darkened the stain so that it would be a challenge and a comfort to someone with a rag later. He thought of his own rag and the chair legs he had wiped in the break room. He felt a clean, brief hunger to do something with his hands that made a place reflect something he had done to it. He swallowed. The room pressed against him with a close air. He said, the word quiet and close to the thought that made it, tried to return you. The set took no notice. He said, don't know why you want me. The hiss kept its flat faithfulness. He said, without knowing he would say it, will you tell me how it ends? The set obliged him, if that's what obliged would be for a thing like this. He saw himself from an angle he had never chosen to look at. The camera perched on the ceiling near the corner where a wall met a wall with a hair of paint on the wrong side. It looked down on the man sitting on the couch. That man looked like any man and not like any man. And he had fresh hair and a shirt that had been worn a day and the posture of someone who has learned late how to sit without injuring himself. He looked briefly and then indirectly toward the plant, which had lifted another small tooth toward the window's light. He looked at the set the way a man looks at a dog he loves and is angry with. He lifted his hand and placed his palm on his chest in that new way he did. He did not say anything. He did not need to. After some ordinary time, he stood and went to the door and opened it and put his head out and listened, and then closed it again and put the chain on. He leaned his forehead against the door. He did that for a long enough piece of time that the camera had to pretend to be interested in the muchness of the rest of the room. He came away from the door, in the image. He walked into the kitchen and stood at the counter without taking anything from a shelf. He put his hands flat on the counter's edge. He did not move. The camera thought he would. The camera hung in place, and in that waiting, there was a tiny surprise, as if the set had learned the beat of Arthur well enough to suspect what beat would come next. And this did not satisfy that beat. Arthur in the room sat on the couch and sat still. Perhaps he was the only man left who could surprise the thing that had made it his job to surprise him. The picture collapsed on itself so that the pixels at the edge of evenness gave up being gentle, and the image showed itself to be made of dots. The dots smoothed. The screen came up on the hallway, the numberless door. The handle turned. No one came out. The handle turned back. It was an ordinary motion, altogether within the daily collection of motions a hand learns, and yet Arthur felt his belly find the floor. The door opened a breath and then closed on that breath. He watched the space between door and frame connect and disconnect, a small kiss of wood and paint, and felt that something old and certain in the world had shifted away from its place. He put his fingertip hard to the bone at the corner of his eye until pain registered more loudly than fear. He was, after that, a man waiting in a room that had once been a place a man could be. He did not leave. He watered the plant with the smallest amount of water because he had read somewhere that most harm are done by kindness. He wiped the ring left by the coffee cup. He swept. He made the bed. He called no one. He kept, like a fool or a saint, to his shift. He came back. He waited, and he watched, and he kept his body ready to stand between himself and something that would take him up. On a deep night that had been cut into pieces by the utility company on a schedule that suited nobody and everyone, there was a wider outage. The street went lax. The emergency lights in the stairwell cut in and out, the way a heart checks itself under worry. The radio bowed into silence and stayed there. His building grew very honest. Without the hum and the moving air of all those machines, it smelled like plaster and old wood and the thin sweetness of aging paint. He opened his window a little and listened to a kind of emptiness no other night had taught him. The only light in his living room came from the set. He had not invited it. The light showed itself directly, without interest in being graceful. The picture was his own face, close enough that he found within it a freckle near his lower lip he had not known he carried. The image had the depth that magnification gives every object, the weird sense that the thing you thought you knew has more land to it than your hand had thought. Arthur leaned forward and then stopped. The man on the screen leaned and stopped. He lifted his hand. The hand lifted. He had the thought that what he was seeing here in the small end of the small hours was not a live picture, but a picture of a very near future, a perverse courtesy the set had begun to show him. He closed his eyes and opened them. The image widened. It let his face fall back into the general frame of a life. The camera slipped to the side and took in the couch and the plant and the scar where the varnish had bubbled on the table from a winter mug. It found the door and rested on it. Arthur could hear his own breath and the small dry noise the plant leaves make when air moves under them. He could make out in the hall a sound like a footfall, and then closer to something like a roll of wheels, very small on a surface, too rough for wheels. He felt the hair on his arms lift and did not marvel at his own animal kindness. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not pray. He went and stood by the door and placed his palm flat on it, the way he had seen himself do in the screen once, and then he let his hands fall and stood there simply because he had nowhere else to stand. A knock came. It was not the knock of a neighbor. It was the "that's not quite it" knock of someone trying out a way to belong. It came once, then again, with the patience of a teacher in a school that is out of money. Arthur looked at the screen because the screen had trained him. The screen showed him not the door, but the hallway outside the door, as seen from the corner where ceiling and wall met. It showed the crown of a head bent a little, the whirl of hair at the back, the shoulder in a jacket wadded into a shape only hard use makes. He had the uncharitable thought that it looked like the super, as if the set wanted to disappoint him by revealing ordinary. He had the charitable thought that it was nobody, that it was everyone, that it was what a knock is when stripped of the person who brings it. He did not open the door. He went very still. He let the set burn his outline into its panel. He waited as the screen offered the crown of the head and the edge of a shoulder, and then slowly slid to show the open eye of the peephole, looking back into itself. He did not look through the peephole. He did not want the sense of that eye meeting his. He put his forehead to the door and heard through the wood a faint noise, almost like the sound of paper being turned slowly back and forth. It was not life. It was an imitation of patience. The knock came again with the mildness of a last try. He said a word he would forget. He did not have speech to place here. The sound in the hall went away, not down the stairs, not to the elevator, just away the way sounds do when they decide not to be interested in a room. Arthur curled his hands and uncurled them. He sat slowly, his knees making their complaint without anger. He watched the set as the image held on the empty hall for longer than needed and then cut for the first time in days to a pitch black, without even the polite light of a mind at work. The apartment grew very dark with it. The window admitted a little street glow, but not enough to outline even the stoic shapes of his furniture. He put his hand out and found the couch edge with his nails. He sat with the darkness and was surprised to learn he could bear it. The dark had weight but not intention. It wanted nothing. He had missed that, the steady indifference of a house after fresher days. He bowed his head and let the weight settle on his neck. He stayed like that until some city circuit found itself again, and the light in the kitchen flickered into readiness, and the refrigerator let go a relieved click that sounded as dear to him as a friend making a bad joke on purpose. He did not move. He waited to learn whether the set would feel snubbed and then would punish him. It did not. It stayed blank. It returned his room to him. He lifted the blanket and placed it over the plant, no longer as a rehearsal of a future, but as a simple shield for a small green thing. He did not smooth it too long. He left it alone. He went to bed and slept without asking anybody's permission. The next day he woke early and did not need the radio. He put a hand into the pocket of his jacket and found the two halves of a hard candy stuck to their old wrappers, soft and foolish and good. He unwrapped one and put it in his mouth. He let the sweetness sit without biting. He looked at the set and found that he could look at it for a whole breath without seeing his own face in it. He considered taking it back again to the shop to see if a third object would be kinder. He decided against it. Objects, he understood now, were misdirection. He did what he had to in the rooms. He turned the coffee maker on and then off and then on again because he could. He washed his hands at the sink and dried them and took pleasure in the clean of the nails he had cleaned last night, like a churchgoer making a second pass with the cloth. He trimmed the plant browning fringe with a kitchen scissors and said, "Excuse me," when the plant seemed to resist. He brought the garbage down the hall and let it go. Work called him in early, and he went. The bus yard welcomed him like it always had, with the mix of fumes and lemon and the vocabulary of task. He carried the buckets and wrung them up. He listened to the men he knew by movements and laughed with them in that abbreviated way men have when they are trying to be kind and masculine at the same time. He kept his eyes away from the small wall sets and the dispatcher's radio. He let himself be small in a system of larger machines and softer rules. He felt contentment so briefly, it was like standing under a building drip and getting a single cold coin to the scalp. At the edge of his break, he took the stairs by the office and stood with his fingers on the metal of the gate and looked at the walkway above where nothing lived. Above, a light turned itself on, then off, then on. He watched this happen without feeling anything he could name. He made a note, mental but firm, of the way the light had failed, and then succeeded. And he tried to keep that shape of a thing in his pocket to take home with him like a stone from a beach. When he came home, the plant had leaned into the day. The set was a blank thing. The room smelled exactly like his soap. The air outside the window had the white taste of a week that had labored. He sat with his socks off, and the new hairs on his neck prickled against the couch back in a way that made him believe in tiny experiences. The radio gave, without static, a song whose lyrics he could not make out, and whose melody set into him a minor contentment he would not be clever enough to summon later. Evening slid into the apartment as if someone had cracked an egg and let the yolk hollow down the wall. He closed the curtains and turned the kitchen light off and let the living room rest in its outside blue. He stood and looked for a very small, ridiculous moment, like a boy deciding whether to knock on his own door. He knocked, very gently, on the frame of the set. He said, "If you have to, then do it." He sat. He put his hands in his lap. He breathed. The screen woke as if that were a courtesy in itself. The hiss settled in. The picture, when it came, took its time in choosing a subject. There was the plant, but that stayed secondary. There was the table, but that, too, was background. The door presented itself. The handle did not move. Arthur did not ask for it to. The set kept the door in its center and allowed sound to enter his room in a thin wire. He could not name the sound. He knew, in the place behind knowing, that the sound was something the set would teach him later to listen for with skill. For the moment, he let it braid itself with the hiss. He understood, without being told, that this was not ending. Nothing in the room carried the smell that ends carry, the smell of extinguished wicks and food gone cold in the way that announces decision. The set had made itself a fact. He was a man who had taken in a fact like a cat takes in a weather. He thought of his mother as Sink and the fly that had finally bumbled its way out the screen, and what he had felt then, a second-hand ease that was not relief. He had wanted there not to have been a fly at all, and yet when the fly took the air, he had been glad to see motion without crisis. He sat until the picture fattened into nothing, and the hiss thinned, and the room presented once more the simple list of what it had. A couch, a chair, a table, a plant, a man. He got to his feet with the heaviness of a man whose body will not surprise him anymore. He went to the door and set his palm against it, and then he unlatched the chain and opened the door and looked out into the hallway, which was a straightforward hallway with a stain near the baseboard and a poster curling at one corner that had not been pressed, and the good emergency light giving its tinny, reliable illumination. He closed the door and pressed his forehead to it and breathed into the wood like a man warming his hands over coals. Behind him, the set flicked once and went black so neatly that he heard no sound at all. He turned and faced its blank and saw the living room return to him, every corner firm, every outline without swallow, no trick of contour or perspective to pull him forward. He nodded like a man who has taught a dog to sit and is rewarding that with gravity instead of sugar. He went to bed, and the bed received him with the indifference of cotton and springs, which is all that a bed owes a man. Sleep did not come lightly or fast. It came like a neighbor showing up with a half cake wrapped in wax paper, apologetic and welcome by default. He took it. He lay on the side with the aches quieted one by one, the toe that had blistered, the place under his shoulder blade that kept sourness like a hidden coin, the hand that had gripped a broom too long over too many years. He drifted and returned and drifted again. The city breathed. The building breathed. The set did whatever a set does when it is not seen. He woke near dawn with the knowledge of a decision sitting in his mouth like a bitter sugar. He would take the bus after his shift to see his mother. He would ask 3 days he did not have, and he would go. He did not owe anyone a reason. He would sit at her kitchen table and look at the same window screen and the same small Formica chips and the same damp towel smell. He would ask to look at the photo albums with the cracked spines and the stick of ancient plastic. He would let the day go to that. He would not tell her about the set and its way. He would simply put his hands on the things that had made him and let that matter more than what was learning him now. He turned in his bed and put his foot under the cool edge of the sheet. He breathed a little laugh at his own tenderness. He let the plan settle like a penny in a jar. He closed his eyes and the building exhaled and the refrigerator knocked its tin knuckle and the day came up without his consent, which is the only way days come if they are going to last. He slept again in a small way and let that count for something. When he woke fully, the set was on, and showing the road that led from his building toward the bus stop, the viewpoint low to the ground like a stray dog's eyes. It watched the curb with a patience that had become an unfunny joke. It watched the patch in the asphalt where the city crew had fixed a winter break and left the surface a little proud, and tires thumped it gently as they passed. It watched a loose scrap of plastic bag make a figure of itself in the corner of a bush and then lie down again. It watched the street do what streets do and made clear to Arthur that it would be with him on that walk. He accepted that in the way a man accepts that rain will happen when he cannot bring a coat. He got up, he dressed, he ate, he watered the plant, he put out an extra dish of water near the baseboard because he had, in his heart, adopted something without event. He stood by the door once more with his palm on the wood. He tilted his head like a man who has learned to listen through a barrier to the larger machine beyond. He stepped out and took the first small appointment life had kept for him, which was to make it to the corner in time to lift his hand for the bus. He lifted his hand. The bus slowed. He did not look back to see whether the set in the corner of his empty room was taking all this down, because a man can stand only so much seeing of himself in a day, and he had decided, quiet and late, to spend his allotment of sight on the living. The bus came gentle out of the morning and sighed to a stop at the curb. Arthur stepped up and paid the driver and found a seat near the middle where the frame of the window did not split his view in a way that would needle him. He always liked the sound a bus makes when it settles, the long inward breath of a machine that has surely learned something by moving and is ready to sit with it a second. He kept his hands on his knees loosely, the way he did when he did not want the fingers to begin their petty rituals. The floor hummed. The lights overhead were the old sort and had that friendly buzz that belongs to a place that has been cleaned 1,000 nights. The sign above the driver tried to announce the next stop, and then, when it could not decide, gave a patient long line of nothing that might have once been a letter. He watched the city fall away and then present itself again in new shapes. Storefronts leaned with the memory of winter, and a string of flags someone had once hung to sell something still flapped, color leached to the cloth's thread. There were the people he knew he would see without naming. A man who had many keys and liked to hold them like a rosary and let them speak in little clatters. A woman who slept with the bone courage of someone who wondered let a moving vehicle move her. The kid, with his head tipped back and the music in his ears set to the level where the building shook inside him more than the song did outside. The bus rocked into its work. Arthur let himself rock with it. He watched for any screen along the way that might find him. There were the usual offenders, the pharmacy sign with its sales and its sorries, the window of a pawn shop where televisions stacked in a stagger cast dark squares into the glass, the narrow high display mounted in the corner of a laundromat, playing a language he had never learned and did not need. He let his eyes pass over each, quick and respectful, the way a person glances at a stranger, and then honors distance. He did not see the kind of blue that meant home. He saw ordinary light. He let it wash him and tried to call it clean. The driver took a right where the road widened and the houses grew shorter, each setback the same, with a lawn that would never win awards and would never need to. Trees threw their shade in narrow flags across the street. The bus slowed. Arthur pressed the green strip. The bell rang with the exact note he expected. He stood and kept his body neat as the bus drew to the curb. The doors opened and gave him the sidewalk with their chunked politeness. He stepped down, and the heat off the road ran his shins like a cat. He took the walk to his mother's place in steady lengths. The yards had a sameness he did not mistrust. Jose water darkened the concrete along one drive and smelled faintly like pennies. Somewhere a weed whacker half worked and half gave up, and then found itself again and chopped at a line that did not care. A dog pushed its nose under a picket and withdrew it with a sneeze. A plastic milk crate waited by a porch a person used as a step because the steps had failed years back and nobody had the cash to call a man. The sameness soothed Arthur the way a lift ride can soothe, all process and no scenery until the doors open. His mother's house had kept its habit of sun on the front. The door paint had done what paint does and peeled at shoulder height first, leaving the low part proud and clean in a way that makes a person think about how a life acquires its shine. He pressed the bell and heard the buzzer inside complain. He felt the pause while she moved inside to come to him, and during that pause he felt, clean and all the way through, the regret of having stayed away. He stood with his hands at his sides, not wanting to greet by banging on the wood, like a man who had a right to hurry someone else. The door opened a crack, then more, and his mother's face found him in the same tidy way it always had, as if she were squinting down a seam she had stitched years back, and finding the thread just where she had left it. She made a sound that was half laugh and half good sense, and let him in. He leaned down enough for a kiss against his cheek, and the soft powder smell that had replaced all her other smells over the last seasons. She did not say anything warm beyond his name. He did not either. They did not need to. The little house took his weight with that faint creak at the pivot in the hallway. He had known that sound all the way back to the place before memory calls itself by name. He set his jacket on the chair with care not to cover hers. The rooms had stayed small as ever, but had filled somehow with air that did not feel like his. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and saw the sink with its window and the fly screen. A dish towel hung in the old place, and he almost laughed because the towel was new, in a way that towels cannot be. It held all the rinses of the last many meals, and still had kept its shape. On the counter, a radio sat too close to the wall, and a bit of the wallpaper had curled in a petal where the heat had kissed it too often and let the glue go. "Made coffee," she said, matter of fact, because she was always proud to offer what she had. He said he would take a cup. They moved in that small choreography of undemanding love, she pouring, he taking, she sighing at the sugar because the sugar always clumped, he pretending to fight the clump and knock it loose with his spoon. The street outside threw a truck's shadow across the room and it slid, and all of it made that household music he had always known and never really heard until this year. He did not turn to look at her set. He knew where it was, because it had always been there. It sat in the corner of the living room and had this precise green at its power light that told a person money had been spent, but not more than a person should spend. He did not want to bring his storms into the corner where his mother watched her mysteries and her afternoon talk and the show about building things that do not need building. He took the coffee and held it in both hands. He listened to her talk about peaches and about the stove on the porch that kept going out and about the neighbor boy who had offered to mow and had done a slanted job of it right to his own pride. He nodded. He put in his small noises. He added the places where a son ought to say and huh. He felt a pause gather itself between them like a shawl a person might drape when she thinks a draft is coming. He asked for the photo albums, and she laughed and said to give her a minute because they were heavy and she does not pretend to have the old arms for lifting. He told her he would get them and went to the hall closet where the albums had always lived. He took them down one by one and stacked them in a stupidly tender way on the coffee table, as if they could be bruised. He sat and opened the first. The plastic clung to the glossy paper in the mean way old plastic does. The photos had that tinfoil look from the age of chemicals, the people all cheerful in their resigned fashions and hair set in shapes that claimed a year and dared the years to come and say different. He put his finger to nobody's face. He did not read backs for dates. He let the images find him. His mother came and sat and told him the same story about the day his aunt fell asleep on a blanket in a park and woke up with a sunburn she talked about for a decade, as if she had earned it. He said, "You always liked this one." She smiled in that quiet way a person smiles when she is glad to be known. They ate a simple lunch together and left the plates without washing. He would have done the dishes and made that into a way to be useful, but she waved him off and sat him back on the couch because she wanted to talk about the barber she trusted and about the changing of a light bulb she could not reach now without a chair. And she had promised herself not to stand on chairs like a fool. He promised he would do the bulb before he left, and knew this too was a little lie because he had not learned to make promise and make it a thing that finished. He hated that about himself. He let her words wash him and tried to stand in them long enough to get clean. The set in the corner stayed polite as a well-trained dog. It kept its little green eye at rest and its screen dull. He tried not to watch it not watching him. When afternoon leaned towards something softer, he found his own eyes closing. And she told him to stretch out and let the couch take him, and he did as told. He drifted. His dream was of a basement with low joists and a light that would not catch. He stood on the bottom step and would not lift the chain because he could feel in his palm the speed the chain would take and the way his grip would fail. He woke with his jaw tight enough to ache, and in the room the television had not moved. His mother was in the kitchen humming that one hymn a person hums when the humming is for the sake of humming and not for the sake of remembering words. He stood and the room received him. He stepped close to the set and, like a child, put his hand near the frame to feel for phantom warmth. His mother said from the kitchen without turning, "Remote's on top if you want it." He said he was fine. He pulled his hand back. He felt foolish and felt the weight of that feeling leave as soon as it came. He went to her and asked for a peel of orange, and she snorted that his timing was always like this. Evening fell into the place without much to say about it. He helped her find the stool because she would not let him climb for the bulb without something under his feet, and he changed the bulb and did not drop it and did not twist it wrong. She clapped in a small way for the light when it caught. They ate together a plate of pasta that cooked too long in water, that boiled too hard because she never had learned gentleness with a stove. The radio spoke half sentences about power in outlying neighborhoods and a caution that people should be simple with their devices if they could stand being simple for a day. His mother rolled her eyes and called it a lot of talking. He said she might be right. They sat in the living room, and the set remained that piece of furniture it had been when a living room was a room that lived and not a room that watched. Arthur thought he had got away with something and then checked himself because thoughts like that are an invitation. It started the way a lot of things start, by being small enough to deserve dismissal. A faint re-quickening in the corner where the plug meets the wall. A pressure in the air, not much different from the change a person feels when a storm decides it will turn in toward the city and finish what it began. The little green eye on the set blinked a single time and held like it was swallowing. The screen brought up that blue that is not sky, but is a promise of picture. His mother's head turned, slow as a sunflower. "That thing," she said. It was not a question. He kept his voice level. He said they could turn it off if she wanted. She shook her head. She did not like to interrupt machines. She said so. He did not fault the superstition. He felt himself carry 100 little superstitions like screws in a pocket he would sort through without noticing until he counted the heads and discovered who he had become. The set gave them a view of a place not their place. A narrow office hallway slid past, carpet tight and worn to a nap in the middle. Arthur braced, expecting the numberless door pocket, and was half grateful to see, instead, a water cooler making its little gulps, and a row of framed awards a committee had gifted itself, and a potted rubber plant with a dust shine. He breathed easier for a second. His mother made a face like she found the newscast boring. The picture glanced around like a timid thief and then found a door and went through it without opening it, as if the seeing part of a world had been granted the privilege of ignoring handles. It was the hallway he knew and did not know, long, clean, the doors with brass plates sliding by, the runner doing its dot pattern without joy. His mother leaned forward. "Oh," she said in the tone of a person calling a curtain mildew and being correct. She did not recognize it and did. He put his hand to his thigh and pressed his knuckles into the muscle as if he could push the anxiety down like dough. The angle carried them to the pocket. The numberless door sat there in its little retreat, the way a sleeper keeps his face in a pillow to avoid day. A hush came into the room that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with people realizing they were going to do the same thing at once. "That a hotel?" his mother said, mild and curious in a way that almost saved him. He kept his breath steady. He felt the heat rising in his neck, the capillaries claiming their blood in a way that made him light. The handle did its tiny, ordinary experiment, a slight movement like a finger readjusting to a weight. It stilled. The camera backed away. The set blinked. The living room filled with picture that was nothing. His mother frowned. She asked him if the cable was paid up. He laughed and said that was not how this worked, even here, even now, because he needed the laugh and she needed him to deliver it to her. The picture returned to the room they were in, and for a half second, Arthur saw himself and his mother seated as if a camera had been mounted, where the set sat in the corner and had been told to watch for the point of interest between two people who have nothing left to say if they do not choose to say it. His mother lifted her hand then, tentative, and waved at the set. The woman in the set waved back, a beat late. She made the face she keeps for the ridiculous. "Huh," she said. The radio on the kitchen counter sighed and powered to a breath. A voice with no station behind it asked the air for a little attention, and then found none. The house ticked and settled the way old houses do when the day changes its mind about the light. Arthur stood and asked if she wanted him to get the fan, and she said, "Not yet." And that little "not yet" carried a patience that he tried to borrow. He told himself he would not sleep here, not at night. He would take the last bus back across. He would be at the depot if the morning called a shift. He would give his mother a kiss and a promise he meant, and he would hold to the railing on the bus when it took the long bend. It was a good plan in the energy of late afternoon. It came apart with evening. The radio told the neighborhood they should expect outages into the morning, and the lights in the block smiled and went soft to prove the radio right. His mother went to hunt candles, because she had always been a woman with candles in a bag from a sale whenever she could. She found them and set them where she would set them, and then did not light them because they said no open flame, and she had learned, as many people do, to follow rules delivered in the tone a parent takes with a child. Arthur offered the couch and she offered the bed, and neither meant any kindness bigger than comfort. He made up the couch in that quiet way that shows a person is not staying. She placed a blanket down with a slowness that told him she wished he were. The set watched them with interest, then fell back into static like a person pretending to be asleep. When night settled for good, he lay with his ear tuned to the house's bass sounds. Pipes breathed. The refrigerator, stubborn animal, refused to admit it was losing its will and knocked once as if to say it was not done. A car down the street idled longer than it had to. A voice drifted with an argument someone had not rehearsed well. His mother in the other room coughed in that soft, habitual way that means health. He had a thought then, as tender as a splinter. He wondered if he had come to say a goodbye and simply could not find a way to name it. He turned that thought over once, and then hid it in his mind, where it could not speak until it wanted to. The set woke and cast the corner blue. He sat up and kept the blanket over his legs because he had never liked being half in or half out of a cover and having to make a choice. The picture gave him now what it had given him in the city, a view from low to the floor. A dog's view, a child's view too, a perspective that likes the undersides of tables and the thin legs of chairs and the lint that even the best mopping cannot persuade to go. It took this cramped room and made it a landscape. It admired the cheap frame on the wall with the watercolor flowers and wondered, in its flat, admiring gaze, what loving hands had hung it and what hands would take it down when it was time. It found the seam in the ceiling and came close enough to show the hairline along it, where a previous season S-Wet had sauntered. It had, in that interested stare, a kind of kindness Arthur could not forgive. Then came the quiet change. It slid past the living room, as if bored, and looked into the hallway. The little nightlight under the baseboard cast a mild beam that made a patch of glow near the floor. His mother did not like to leave the hall dark. She had always said so, because then she would see the dark as a thing, and not as a place. The set lingered there, on that small island of gentleness. It let Arthur feel the mercy of an old person's habit. He whispered, not lifting his voice above breath, that he was grateful. He did not know if he was speaking to the room or the voltage or any creature behind it. The angle of the view shifted toward the end of the hall, where the door to the basement was kept. He knew the door as he knows all the doors of his childhood, the weight of it, the hinge squeal, the way the house smells change when the door opens to let up air from under everything. The hand that followed appeared in the frame, his hand by the scar near the knuckle, and placed itself on the knob and did not turn. He felt the place in his palms where old wood had worn a polish through the rub of years, and he could feel that stamp of time even before he wrapped his fingers around it in the room. He stood. He crossed the carpet. He put his palm gently to the knob and waited as if the waiting were the point. In the set, the hand turned the knob and the door drew inward. In the room, his hand did not move. He could not decide whether he was trusting the picture or testing it. From the open door in the set came no change of light, no billow of cool, just the idea of breadth, a darker edge where a flight of stairs would fall away into the house's belly. In the room, Arthur pressed his ear to the wood and heard the familiar nothing that basements have when they are good basements. A dry silence full of cardboard and old bolts. He let his forehead rest against the panel. He stepped back and lifted his hands and let them hang. His mother made a sound from her room, a sleep murmur like the ones mothers make when they are on the seam of waking to lift a child and make sure he has a blanket. He looked toward her door. The set had no interest in her. The set wanted the empty space where a stair would lead. His jaw clenched and then did not. He closed the basement door and moved his hand away and let his fingers tap the panel once, twice, the way a person pats a dog they're telling to stay. He slept a little and woke, slept a little and woke. Morning came with its easy justice. They ate together with the sleepy politeness people keep after a visitor has stayed over. She asked him about buses, and he answered for the sake of answering. He fixed the cupboard hinge she had lied about not needing fixed. He tied the kitchen bag and took it to the can by the back step and let the lid clap without waking the person he used to be. When he came inside, she had made it clear that she would not grab at him to stay. He thanked her for her food and for her patience. She told him to get a haircut when he needed one. He touched the short hair with his palm, sheepish, and she smiled because she had seen it already and had said nothing to let him have the pleasure of telling her himself. They hugged in the doorway like people do when they have never learned how to hug without making their chests polite. He walked to the bus stop, and the set in her living room silent as a faithful dog told to watch. The house did whatever sets do when the people who have given them a room are gone from that room. He might have believed on the ride back that he had gathered what he needed to gather and tucked it under his shirt. The map of his city returned, grid overlaid on memory. The depot would smell the same as last night. His room would keep his plant in the slow green stubbornness that might outlive him. He will go back to the routines that have been bent, and he will learn to account for the bend the way men learn to tie a lopsided shoe and move on. He repeated this until it shaped itself to his breath. When he opened his own door, the apartment greeted him in its neutral tone. The plant on the sill had lifted itself toward a slice of light. He put the kettle on for habit's sake, and then did not turn the knob because there was no reason for tea beyond the wish to mark an hour. He took his jacket off, and the chair took it in its old way. He stood and swiveled once on his heel and let the little turn dismiss the weight of travel. He did not look at the set. He felt it in the way a person feels a storm outside the house, a pressure more than anything. He stood at last and gave himself a chance. He turned. The screen was dark and deep in the way that had always bothered him, the heavy kind of black where a color thinks it is a room and asks you to step inside. He stood and leaned, then did not lean. All the motions a person makes when they intend to quarter something invisible. He reached for the plug and remembered there wasn't one. He smiled at his own mind and felt old, thinking he had reached for a rotary phone that had left the world quietly while he was working the late shift. He put his hand on the frame. He let it stay there long enough to take the faint warmth. "I went," he said, in a voice like a man announcing his returns to an empty house so that the house knows to fall back into its human size. The set sent him a polite bloom of blue. He took that as acknowledgement and knew he was no longer being clever. He was being broken in. What followed did not reinvent the pattern. It elaborated. The picture tried on angles like hats, and he learned the manners of being watched from the floor. From the corner where a ceiling meets its seam, from the inside of a cupboard, which must have been fantasy because no camera can live inside a cupboard unless a man places it there. He did not fight receipt of any of it. He sat and let it pass in front of him, the way a person sits with a train at night and watches the lights of sleeping houses pass like answers to questions he had not asked for years. He worked. He returned. He slept. He held a line where he could. He let the radio S-loop murmur when it needed to and did not reach to fine-tune it, because perfection breeds a new kind of noise. The notice in the lobby about electricity replaced itself at intervals with a new notice that said the same thing with fresher toner. At the depot, the small set above the dispatch desk learned a new trick of its own and went to a slow, clean white at odd times, empty and full of static that wasn't. The crew lead swore charmingly, like a man sorry to waste the poetry. Arthur kept the mop moving. He kept the rag in his pocket. He had discovered that wiping down a chair leg is a prayer if you let it be one. He did not tell anyone about his discovery. He would have sounded foolish and then cruel. There came in time the day when the set offered him himself, not by showing present or by showing his very next breath, but by flinging him into a stretch he could call future only because there was no other name he had for it. He sat on the couch with his hands folded while the screen brought forward a version of his living room that had unlearned something he was still teaching it. The plant was taller, the pot rim stained where water had argued with laziness and won. The blanket on the couch had been moved to the back of a chair and kept a sag only a blanket learns after nights of being pulled over a half-sleeping body. The window curtain had a small tear at the bottom that would catch each time air moved in and asked to be mended, and he could see he had not yet mended it. The man in the picture, himself and not, sat with his hands in a different way, as if a teacher had placed them there and stepped away. His hair had grown out and then been cut again and sat rough. He had the posture of a person who had surrendered to a bed and had then taught himself how to be upright again. Arthur did not breathe for a second. He did not know which part of him the image had reached for, but one part had lifted its chin. He could have told the set that he did not need help becoming what the set showed. He could have told it the world was good enough at making men into watchers without a set, with an attitude. He did not expend the breath. He watched the future. Him stand and go to the door and unlock and unlatch it and open to the hall and place his head into the hall and listen, and then close the door again with a softness that took practice. He watched that man draw the chain slowly, the way you draw a bow on a careful instrument when you want life and not error. He watched him return and sit and wait and be. When the image shifted, he braced for the numberless door. The set was not a boring thing. It offered another manner of corridor, one he had never walked, a hospital sort of space with machines against the wall that did not blink but hummed in that confident pitching way that says, "We have built ourselves to tolerate failure, and we'll show you our tolerance until you stop asking questions." The camera moved close to a smooth instrument Arthur did not know and pressed until the lights in it became nothing but their own small suns. Then it drifted away down the hall past rooms with their curtains drawn shut to give a kind of privacy, and paused at a window that showed a small square of outside where rain worried at a length of gutter. He wanted to ask the set if this was what it wanted from him, to place him before rooms that contain a life until the rooms could be mistaken for the life. He wanted to scold it for things it could not have done without him. He lifted his hand and put it down. He cancelled his own scolding in mercy to his throat. He let the hiss be the voice that carried the matter forward. The outages in his part of the city did not end. They learned their way around the work people who had been told to end them. He did not mind a house that grew very honest each time the power bent and went away. He minded the way his muscles anticipated the return, every fiber braced to receive the fridge knock and the light bloom and the radio sigh, as if a friend had managed to make it back after a broken down ride. The plant liked the quiet times better. He admired it for that. He watered it in the manner of someone backing a trailer for the first hour, cautious, ashamed to be cautious, and one misstep from either flooding the place or not doing it enough. An evening rose with a smooth weather, and he walked down the long block, a hand in his jacket pocket out of nothing but habit. He came back with an apple he would cut into pieces and salt, and with a length of electrical tape, because the torn curtain edge had worked on his mind, and he was not going to mend it, but he was going to keep it from catching. He taped it, and had the relief of an act completed, and stood for a moment admiring this tiny, tidy betrayal of the larger need to sew. When he turned, the set was already awake and showing the dark hinge where his fingers had just been. He touched the tape again, and unable to help himself, smoothed it with his thumb a second time. The man on the screen did the same, a beat late. Arthur did not apologize for making himself predictable. He sat with the apple and the salt, and taught the salt stubbornness to each slice. The set gave him the service corridor at the end of his hall again, the curl of poster corner, the stain where the mop missed and feet testified, and he felt the deep domestic safety of a mark that stays. He watched long enough that he could have sworn the stain darkened in real time and then paled, and he told himself no, because there is no reason to grant powers to a set when a man has enough to do to get through supper. It was past supper when the knock that was not quite a knock came again. He did not flinch. He placed the last slice of apple into his mouth and did not crunch it, because sound gives away a person's heart, and he wanted to keep his in his chest for one more breath. He stood, The knock came again and was slightly more practiced, not because a person had become better at knocking, but because whatever had carried that knocking had learned the measure of his door. He glanced at the screen. The screen had the hallway in the center, and though the viewpoint had shifted low, it gave him the whirl of a crown of hair and the shoulder of a jacket and the same patient shape of a person trying to stand the way neighbors stand, open enough to be allowed in, closed enough to keep a friendliness from being a trespass. He placed his palm to the wood and felt the simple heat of a door in summer. He spoke a word a person speaks to a dog who has not learned the visit is over. The knock paused. He felt a motion through the door that could have been shifting feet and could have been the press of something like breath. He turned his head and looked toward the set and saw the eye of the peephole, great and close, staring back at itself. He did not put his own eye there. He had learned. He kept his forehead on the door and stayed, and let his posture talk to whatever would read posture. How long he held that, he did not know. He counted a kind of breath and then found he had stopped counting. The knock did not come again. The hallway sound withdrew into the general cloth of building silence. On the screen, the peephole backed away politely, and the corridor returned to its bland perfection. Because he was a man who still had ordinary life inside him, he laughed once sharply at himself, and then he stopped because laughter here in this felt like telling a story to the wrong person at a wrong hour. The set did not celebrate its small victory or mourn its small defeat. It showed him his own couch and his own coffee table and the slight shimmer on the varnish where the winter mug had raised a bubble generations ago in the life of that table. It loved that shimmer the way it loved the fly on his Mother S screen and the crease in his glove and the bubble in the clear thumbtack. It had dignity in its preferences. He felt against the spike of fear that rose in him without permission, something like respect. The way a man respects a river that does not care about his reasons for crossing. A day later, perhaps two, perhaps fewer than that and more. He went once more to the basement door in his Mother S house in his mind and placed his hand there and left it because in all the left-right shudder of his days, he had learned that some tasks are built on the leaving of a hand, not the turning. He called her, and she told him about a squirrel that had gotten into the attic and then gotten out. He asked how she knew it was one squirrel, and she laughed and said she had spoken to it. He did not tell her about the set and what it wanted, because he could not give it room there and keep his promise to be a son. The season turned without drama. The notices in the lobby went from bold to more bold. The super changed nothing, but kept looking at the ceiling as if the building S problems had been written on it in an ink only he knew how to see. The city let its signs talk about patience and about maintenance and about partners in service, and nobody had energy to be angry at the language or to be soothed by it. At the depot, the machines lined up, mouths open, ready to be scrubbed of their day, and the crew did the scrubbing that makes a worker feel like he has done something someone will sit on and say, "This is cleaner than it was." Arthur loved that feeling. He held it. He kept the little rag in his pocket and took it out and put it back in, and felt each time the honest anchor of fabric. On a night when the outages dipped and returned and dipped in a rhythm he would have called musical if he were less stern, the set decided to make its last cleverness for him. He did not know it was a last. He did not want a last and did not want a forever. He discovered to be told there was no ending and that he would be allowed to be a man who keeps opening a door and pressing his head to a hall and listening and closing the door again. He wanted the charm of repetition. He wanted to be a man who got to keep his little cussedness. The set did not give him that. It gave him something else. The picture lifted slowly away from the rug and the table legs. It traveled with that soft thief motion to the frame of his own front door and paused there the way a person pauses before touching a sleeping shoulder. It gave him an impossible point of view from the top corner outside his own door, where no eye had ever been. He saw the bruise on the door-s paint at ankle height, where someone moving a box had failed grace one move and left penance. He saw the emergency light do its brave flicker in its bracket, the way a small lamp dies by degrees before making its tiny comeback. He saw the sneaker of a neighbor come into a slant of light and leave, the tentative gait he had recognized every night before, but had never admired until he did. He watched until he knew that the set had adopted the hallway as part of his house. Then, with as little drama as a coin landing on its back, the picture fell into the numberless door. It did not need to carry him down the long, clean corridor because it had taught him the geometry and could now drop him onto the exact spot, the way a skilled hand pours batter on a griddle and makes a perfect circle without looking. There was the pocket and the shadow that pocket collects. There was the brass without numbers. There was the handle with its pretend. Arthur did not let the hammer in his chest argue the thing out of existence. He stood and came so close to the set that his breath clouded the glass. He did not wipe at it. He watched himself form a blurrier man. He waited for the little twitch. He did not have to wait. The handle turned. It turned in a way that did not belong to fear or to rehearsal. It turned as if a hand that knew it had rejoined what belongs. The door opened a breath. In that tasteful nothing of space, he saw less than darkness. He saw what painters of black want to make and fail. Not a color, not the absence of color. The camera did not move in. It stayed where a person stays when a person has learned he should not put his head under a machine. He knew the set was better than he was because it knew at least that. He watched. He did not go forward into the cabinet to touch the screen. He placed his palm flat to the frame and remembered the night he had spoken "I mem here" and felt peace at the words. He was here, and the set was here, and the door was there, and the world had arranged itself in a cruel tidy that made him feel dignified and helpless in the same muscle. Nothing came out of the door. The door rested on its breath. Somewhere in the building, someone tried a switch and found the light unwilling. The radio on the counter tried for a word and forgot it. He could smell the dust the way you do when a room has heated itself on a day and given itself up in the dark. He let his breath out. He let it in. He put his forehead to the frame. He said, because he had to, "If this is the thing, then let it be the thing." The set obliged him by doing nothing. It kept the image in place and welcomed him to wait. He waited. He waited long enough that the sensible part of a mind would call him foolish, and yet not long enough for the part of a mind that hopes to call itself brave to feel satisfied. The door did not close. The door did not open. The hiss had steadied itself into a sound that was not white or grey, but the soft industry of a well-tuned shop. He thought of the depot and the regularity there. He stayed with the feeling until it warmed something in his chest that had been cold a long time. He drew the plant's blanket over the plant with that small, careful hand and did not pet longer than needed. He checked the window S-tape because kindness is a way of bending your life about yourself until your body believes it. He turned off the kitchen light and let the living room be its own day. He sat and let his hands be unhands for a few breaths. The set kept the door in the frame and did not speak another word to him. He could have got up and left. He could have slept. He could have made noise. He did none of these. He performed the only art there was left to perform in such a room. He gave it and himself and the door the kind of stillness that has to be torn down to be broken. That is how he ended it, which is not an ending. He did what men in small apartments do when they have learned the limits of their control and found dignity within them. He waited while the door gathered the rest of its breath and did not call to it, and did not invite it, and did not forbid it, and did not go to it, and did not run from it. He waited because waiting had finally become the whole of the event. He waited until the hiss grew so faint he could place it anywhere he liked, and then he lay down on his couch and rested his hand on his chest with fingers turned lightly in, and the room stayed as it was, a couch a chair, a table, a plant under a blanket, a man, a door in a pocket on a screen that refused an ending, and the low sound of a building making its case to continue. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.